was carrying our baby when my husband looked me in the eyes and accused me of cheating. He threw a medical folder onto my lap, declaring to our entire community that he was completely sterile. He kicked me out of our home with nothing but the clothes on my back, convinced he had destroyed me. He refused to listen to reason until the official DNA results arrived, and the perfect, treacherous life he had built began to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. The late summer heat hung heavy over the sprawling backyard of Pastor Miller's home in our affluent suburban neighborhood. It was the first Sunday of the month, which meant the entire congregation had gathered for our traditional post-church potluck. The air was thick with the comforting scent of barbecue, freshly baked cherry pies, and the polite, hushed chatter of the community's elite. I sat at a long wooden picnic table under the shade of an old oak tree, my hand resting protectively over my swollen belly. I was 31 years old and exactly 24 weeks pregnant. My name is Caroline. 3 years ago, I gave up a deeply fulfilling career as a high school history teacher to support my husband, Liam. He was a highly respected wealth manager, and he convinced me that his grueling corporate climb required a full-time wife to host his demanding clients and manage our domestic life. I willingly graded his early practice exams, ironed his bespoke suits, and poured every ounce of my energy into being the perfect submissive partner. I believed with all my heart that my silent sacrifices were building a beautiful, secure foundation for our growing family. Liam sat right next to me on the wooden bench, his posture unusually rigid. He was 35, incredibly handsome, and impeccably dressed in a tailored navy blazer that made him look like the absolute model of professional success. To the rest of the congregation, we were the picture-perfect couple. But today, something felt chillingly wrong. He had been cold and distant all morning, ignoring my attempts at conversation and pulling away when I asked him to feel the baby kick. I naively told myself he was just stressed about a massive new portfolio acquisition at his firm. I always made excuses for his emotional absences. I was so incredibly blind. The cheerful clinking of iced tea glasses suddenly slowed as Liam stood up from the bench. He grabbed a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against the side of his crystal glass. The clear, ringing sound cut straight through the cheerful murmurs of the crowd. Dozens of faces turned toward us. I saw the smiling, expectant faces of our neighbors, our friends, and the esteemed church elders. I smiled too, looking up at my husband with absolute, unwavering trust. I naturally assumed he was going to make a heartwarming toast. Perhaps he was going to thank the community for their ongoing support, or formally share his excitement about our impending arrival. Instead, Liam reached inside his tailored jacket and pulled out a crumpled manila medical folder. His eyes, which were usually so warm and charismatic, were now as cold and dead as winter ice. He did not look out at the crowd. He looked down at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Thank you all for being here today." Liam began, his voice projecting clearly across the suddenly quiet yard. "We gather here every Sunday in the spirit of truth and fellowship, and today, the truth absolutely must be brought to the light." My heart fluttered with a sudden, inexplicable panic. I reached out to gently touch his arm, but he violently jerked away from my hand as if I were carrying a contagious disease. He threw the crumpled medical folder directly onto my lap. It landed with a dull, heavy thud against my pregnant belly. "I want everyone here to know exactly who Caroline is," Liam declared, his voice rising, sounding sharp and infinitely cruel. "For months, she has paraded around this church, happily soaking up your blessings, your prayers, and your generous gifts for this baby. She has played the part of the devoted, faithful Christian wife perfectly, but it is all a disgusting, calculated lie." The silence in the yard became absolute. It was the kind of suffocating, terrifying silence that precedes a devastating car crash. I stared at the folder on my lap, my brain completely unable to comprehend the words coming out of my husband's mouth. "Liam, what are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling so badly I could barely form the words. What is this? He ignored my pleading completely, raising his voice even louder so the people standing in the very back of the garden could hear him clearly. I underwent a comprehensive medical evaluation last week. Liam announced, his tone dripping with righteous anger. I have been completely sterile since birth. It is a biological impossibility for me to ever father a child. It is a painful medical fact I chose to keep private until my loving wife miraculously turned up 6 months pregnant. A collective theatrical gasp erupted from the congregation. The sound hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The blood drained entirely from my face, and a burning, humiliating flush crawled rapidly up my neck. My heart began to pound violently against my ribs, hammering so fast and so hard I could barely draw a breath into my lungs. I opened the medical folder with shaking hands. The clinical jargon blurred together through my rising tears, but the bold red letters printed at the bottom of the page screamed at me. 0 sperm count. Absolute sterility. My mind went completely white. It was entirely impossible. I had never touched another man. I had never even looked at another man since the day I stood at the altar and took my wedding vows. I was carrying Liam's biological child. I knew it with every fiber of my being. That is a lie. I choked out tears, instantly pooling in my eyes and spilling down my hot cheeks. Liam, please stop this. You know I have never been unfaithful to you. This baby is yours. There must be a terrible mistake with the clinic or the test results. A mistake, Liam scoffed, letting out a cruel, mocking laugh that echoed terribly across the manicured lawn. The only mistake was trusting a manipulative cheat like you. Tell me right now, Caroline, whose bastard are you actually carrying? Was it the landscaper, one of the men from your little book club? How long did you honestly think you could play me for an absolute fool? The horrific whispers began instantly. The very women who had just praised my maternal glow 10 minutes ago were now looking at me with undisguised contempt. Mrs. Higgins, the elderly choir director, covered her mouth in dramatic horror, pulling her husband away from the table. Pastor Davis shook his head, looking away from me in deep, judgmental disappointment. They were judging me. They were condemning me without a trial based solely on the dramatic word of a man who was publicly destroying his pregnant wife. I felt completely naked, stripped of my dignity, my morals, and my hard-earned reputation in a matter of seconds. I was surrounded by dozens of people, yet I had never felt more terrifyingly alone in my entire life. My hands gripped the rough edges of the wooden picnic table, my knuckles turning stark white as a massive wave of dizziness washed over me. My baby kicked hard against my ribs, reacting to the massive spike of adrenaline flooding my system. I tried to stand up, desperate to defend myself to the crowd, but my legs felt like heavy blocks of lead. Liam, please stop this insanity, I begged, my voice cracking with desperation. We can go to a real doctor together tomorrow. We can do a medical DNA test right now. I will prove to you that this is your son. Please do not do this to our family. Liam leaned down toward me. To the shocked onlookers, it might have looked like a final moment of tragic, heartbreaking intimacy between a broken husband and his cheating wife. But as his face came close to mine, a wave of profound nausea hit me. Beneath the familiar, expensive scent of his designer sandalwood cologne, there was something else entirely. The sharp, sickly sweet stench of cheap vanilla and jasmine perfume was clinging heavily to his lapel. It was an overwhelming scent that I did not own, a scent that belonged to someone else. The realization struck me like a bucket of freezing ice water. He was not acting out of spontaneous, heartbroken rage over a medical discovery. He was far too composed. His speech was far too theatrical. His eyes were completely devoid of any genuine pain or betrayal. Instead, they held a dark, calculated, arrogant triumph. He leaned his mouth very close to my ear, and his voice dropped to a venomous, chilling whisper that only I could hear. Save your pathetic tears, Caroline. The performance is over. You have exactly 1 hour to go back to the house, pack your trash, and get off my property. If you are not entirely gone by the time I get there, I will have the police physically remove you for trespassing. I stared up at him, my eyes wide with absolute horror and a dawning, agonizing clarity. The man I had loved unconditionally, the man I had sacrificed my beloved teaching career for, was looking at me as if I were a diseased pest to be exterminated. He straightened his posture, adjusting his suit jacket with a sickeningly calm demeanor. He turned back to the shocked congregation, playing the part of the deeply wounded martyr to absolute perfection. "I apologize to you all for having to witness this disgraceful scene," Liam said, his voice dripping with expertly feigned sorrow. "I ask for your continued prayers and your grace during this incredibly difficult time as I navigate the tragic end of my marriage." With those final words, he turned on his heel and walked away. He did not look back at me. He walked straight out of the yard, leaving me sitting completely alone at the picnic table, clutching a fake medical report and my pregnant belly. The harsh whispers of the church crowd grew louder, wrapping around me like a suffocating, heavy blanket. Not a single person stepped forward to help me. No one offered a comforting hand or a kind word. In their eyes, I was the adulterous wife, the shameless sinner who had defiled their sacred community. I forced myself to stand up. My legs trembled so violently, I thought I would collapse directly onto the grass, but I absolutely refused to give them the sick satisfaction of watching me fall. I grabbed my purse, ignoring the stinging tears that were blinding my vision, and walked toward the exit. Every single step felt like walking barefoot on broken glass. I passed by the women I had hosted in my living room, the couples I had shared warm holidays with. They parted like the Red Sea, turning their faces away in disgust, pulling their children closer as if my supposed betrayal was a contagious virus. I kept my head down, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The summer heat was incredibly oppressive, but I was shivering uncontrollably from a bone-deep cold. I reached my car parked on the street, unlocked the door with fumbling, shaking fingers, and practically fell into the driver's seat. I slammed the heavy door shut, locking myself inside the quiet, stifling interior of the sedan. The moment I was finally alone, the emotional dam completely broke. I let out a guttural, heart-wrenching sob, wrapping my arms tightly around the steering wheel as the tears poured freely down my face. My husband had just publicly humiliated me in front of everyone I knew. He had falsely accused me of carrying another man's child and banished me from my own life. I was 24 weeks pregnant, utterly alone, and given a strict 1-hour eviction notice by a man who smelled strongly of another woman's cheap perfume. I wiped my wet face with the back of my trembling hand, my mind racing in a state of pure, unadulterated panic. I bought to get home. I had to gather my things before he made good on his threat to call the police. I genuinely thought that packing my bags and leaving my home would be the absolute worst part of this living nightmare. I had no idea that the true devastating horror of Liam's calculated financial betrayal had not even begun. I slammed the heavy door of my sedan shut. I locked myself inside the stifling interior. The summer heat trapped behind the glass was instantly suffocating. I jammed the key into the ignition with fumbling fingers. My hands were trembling so violently that I scraped my knuckles against the plastic steering column. I cranked the air conditioning to its maximum setting. The icy blast of air hit my tear-stained face. It sent violent shivers down my spine. I threw the car into drive and tore away from the manicured curb of Pastor Miller's sprawling suburban estate. My chest heaved with ragged, jagged gasps. My heart was pounding against my ribs with such a terrifying force that I thought it might completely shatter my ribcage. I could still hear the shocked gasps of the church congregation echoing loudly in my ears. I could still see the judgmental, disgusted expressions of the women I had considered my closest friends. They had parted like the Red Sea to let me flee. Not a single person had reached out to catch me as my entire world collapsed into absolute ruin. I drove blindly through the affluent neighborhood. The massive colonial houses and perfectly trimmed hedges blurred into meaningless streaks of green and gray outside my window. For 3 years, I'd poured every ounce of my soul into building our perfect life. I was a dedicated high school history teacher before I met Liam. I loved my students. I loved the fulfilling nature of my career. But Liam had convinced me that his grueling trajectory as a senior wealth manager required a traditional, supportive wife at home. He told me he needed a sanctuary. He needed someone to host his high-net-worth clients, manage the domestic chaos, and be his unwavering anchor. I gave up my classroom without a single complaint. I handed over my independence because I loved him with a blinding, absolute trust. I deposited my final teaching paychecks and my entire accumulated savings directly into our shared accounts. I believed his sweet, manipulative promises that we were building an empire together. I believed we were constructing a secure, impenetrable fortress for the family we desperately wanted to start. I pressed my trembling right hand flat against my swollen abdomen. I was 24 weeks pregnant. The baby gave a sudden sharp kick against my palm. A fresh wave of agonizing, suffocating sorrow washed over me. Liam had just stood in front of our entire community and threw a crumpled medical folder onto my lap. He had looked me dead in the eyes and announced that he had been completely sterile since birth. He had branded the innocent growing child inside me as the bastard product of a filthy affair. The stench of the cheap vanilla and jasmine perfume that had clung to his tailored navy blazer suddenly flooded my memory, making me physically gag. I pulled the car into the empty parking lot of a quiet, unassuming strip mall on the edge of town. I threw the gear shift into park and completely broke down. I buried my face in my hands, sobbing until my throat was completely raw and my lungs burned for oxygen. He had given me exactly 1 hour to return to our house, pack my trash, and get off his property before he called the police to have me arrested for trespassing. I could not go back there. I could not face his cold, triumphant arrogance while I was in the state of absolute shattered vulnerability. I needed to find a cheap, quiet motel room. I needed a safe place to hide for the night so I could figure out how to survive the destruction of my life. I wiped my wet face with the back of my hand. I forced myself to unbuckle my seatbelt. My legs felt like heavy blocks of lead as I pushed the car door open and stepped out into the blazing afternoon sun. The heat radiating from the black asphalt was dizzying, but a bone-deep cold had firmly settled into my marrow. I walked slowly toward the standalone bank, ATM positioned near the entrance of a convenience store. My pregnant belly made my balance unsteady, and I leaned heavily against the brick wall for support. I reached into my purse and pulled out my primary debit card. It was linked to the central joint checking account Liam and I had utilized since the first week of our marriage. Liam was a financial expert. He had always insisted on managing our portfolios and monitoring our daily balances. He claimed it was the most efficient way to maximize our wealth and secure our future. I never once questioned his authority. I inserted the card into the machine and carefully typed in my personal identification number. The digital screen prompted me to select a withdrawal amount. I selected $200. It was a modest amount, just enough to cover a budget motel room and perhaps a hot meal. The machine hummed and clicked for several agonizing seconds. Then a sharp, unpleasant electronic beep pierced the quiet air. The screen flashed a stark, glaring message. Transaction declined due to insufficient funds. I blinked repeatedly. My tear-swollen eyes struggled to focus on the glowing green letters. I shook my head, assuming there was a simple network connectivity error or a temporary security hold on the account. I pressed the screen again. This time, I selected $100. The machine processed the request. The exact same harsh beep echoed in my ears. Transaction declined due to insufficient funds. A cold, creeping dread began to crawl slowly up my spine. This was absolutely impossible. We had over $200,000 in our liquid savings accounts alone. That did not even include the retirement funds or the aggressive investment portfolios Liam managed. My teaching salary alone had contributed nearly $100,000 over the years before I resigned. I canceled the transaction entirely. I retrieved my plastic card and stumbled back to my sedan. My breath hitched in my throat. The panic was no longer just an emotional response to his public cruelty. It was rapidly transforming into a primal, terrifying fear for my basic physical survival. I practically fell back into the driver's seat. I locked the heavy doors behind me, creating a desperate barrier between myself and the outside world. My hands were shaking so severely that I dropped my smartphone onto the floorboard twice before I could successfully unlock the screen. I opened our bank mobile application. The loading circles spun around and around for what felt like an absolute eternity. When the primary dashboard finally materialized on the screen, my heart physically stopped beating for a full, terrifying second. The balance on our joint checking account was $12.43. Our primary high-yield savings account displayed a balance of absolute zero. Our dedicated emergency fund was entirely gone. I stared closely at the glowing digital screen. My brain completely refused to process the numbers. $12.43. I tapped frantically on the transaction history tab. My breath came in shallow, panicked wheezes. I scrolled down the screen month by month, and my eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. This was not a sudden banking error. This was not a temporary hold. This was a systematic, deliberate draining of every single cent we owned. Over the past 6 months, there were massive sequential wire transfers, actively leaving our joint accounts. $10,000 here, $25,000 there. I clicked on a specific transfer from 3 months ago. It was for $40,000, routed to a private holding company I had never heard of. I remembered the exact day that transfer occurred. I had been suffering from terrible morning sickness. Liam had brought me ginger tea in bed, kissed my forehead, and told me he was working late to secure a new college fund trust for the baby. While I was vomiting in the bathroom, relying entirely on his love and protection, he was actively wiring our life savings to a phantom account. Another transfer, this one for $15,000, was labeled simply as a luxury maritime retainer. We did not own a boat. We had never even discussed a boat. The sheer audacity of his theft was breathtaking. Every single deposit I had made from my years of teaching, every bonus I had saved, every birthday check from my parents that I had dutifully handed over to him for our shared future had been surgically extracted. I scrolled further back, tracing the devastating timeline of the withdrawals. 6 months ago. That was exactly when I had first happily surprised him with the news of my pregnancy. That was exactly when his sudden late nights at the office had started becoming a regular routine. He had not just kicked me out of our home today in a fit of spontaneous, jealous rage. He had spent half a year actively and financially slaughtering me in the dark. He had purposely waited until he had successfully drained every last drop of my life savings before he dropped that fabricated medical folder on my lap. He wanted to make absolutely sure that when he threw me out onto the street, I would have zero financial resource to fight back. He knew I would not even be able to afford a basic consultation with a lawyer, let alone secure a safe place to sleep tonight. I sat in the freezing interior of my sedan. The harsh, undeniable truth settled over my trembling shoulders like a heavy, suffocating shroud. He had completely stolen my youth. He had stolen my dedicated career. He had stolen my money. He had purposefully dragged my pristine reputation through the mud in front of our entire church community to ensure I would have no allies. He had deliberately labeled my innocent, unborn son as a filthy bastard to secure his own victimhood. And then something extraordinary happened. The agonizing, heart-wrenching pain that had been entirely consuming my body for the past hour suddenly stopped. The hot, desperate tears that had been pouring down my cheeks dried up instantly. Something deep inside my chest completely snapped. The naive, submissive, unconditionally trusting Caroline died right there in the driver's seat of that car. A terrifying, absolute silence fell over my previously chaotic mind. The burning agony of his betrayal rapidly crystallized into solid, unbreakable ice. I replayed the traumatic scene at the church potluck in my head, analyzing it not with the broken heart of a wife, but with the cold, steely precision of a survivor. I remembered his theatrical, perfectly timed speech. I remembered his calm, completely unbothered eyes scanning the crowd to gauge their reaction. I remembered the sharp, sickening stench of that cheap vanilla and jasmine perfume heavily lingering on his lapel when he leaned in to whisper his final threat. I had smelled that exact perfume before. It belonged to the young, flashy daughter of one of the senior church elders, a girl named Savannah who always seemed to linger just a little too long around Liam during the Sunday coffee hours. The puzzle pieces violently slammed together in my mind. The money, the fake medical folder, the sudden eviction, the perfume. He was clearing the stage for a new, younger, wealthier woman. He was using the religious community's strict moral codes against me, ensuring they would cast the first stones so he could walk away looking like an innocent martyr. This was not a sudden outburst of irrational, blind jealousy. This was not a man who genuinely believed his devoted wife had cheated on him. This was a highly intelligent, deeply cynical predator executing a premeditated, flawless assassination of my life. He needed an unassailable excuse to completely discard me while keeping every single penny of the substantial wealth we had built together. By framing me as a shameless adulteress and proudly claiming complete, lifelong sterility, he ensured that the religious community would entirely shun me. He ensured the local courts would offer me zero sympathy. He assumed I would be too heavily destroyed by the sheer magnitude of the public shame to ever demand an audit of the marital assets. He thought I was just a gullible, weak, domesticated housewife who would crawl away into a dark corner and cry herself into silent oblivion. He truly thought I would be too paralyzed by the overwhelming public disgrace to actually look at the numbers. But Liam had made one fatal, incredibly arrogant miscalculation. He forgot that before I spent my evenings ironing his expensive suits and cooking his gourmet meals, I was a highly educated woman with a deeply analytical mind. I placed my smartphone carefully back into my leather purse. I sat up perfectly straight in my seat. I adjusted the rearview mirror so I could look directly into my own eyes. The reflection staring back at me was completely transformed. My eyes were no longer swollen with pathetic, desperate grief. They were entirely cold sharp and radiating a steely, unyielding resolve. My gaze was as sharp as a knife. The terrified, abandoned pregnant woman was gone forever. In her place was a fiercely protective mother who had just realized she was actively dealing with a monster. I placed both of my hands firmly on the steering wheel. I did not have a single dollar to my name. I did not have a warm home to return to tonight. I did not have a single friend left in my community who would answer my phone calls. But I had my intellect. I had my absolute certainty of the truth. And I possessed a burning righteous fury that would absolutely not be extinguished until I had completely dismantled the fraudulent, treacherous life he was trying to build on the ashes of my sacrifices. He wanted to leave me with absolutely nothing. But he was about to discover that a woman who has nothing left to lose is the most dangerous creature on earth. I took a deep, steadying breath, shifted the car into drive, and pulled out of the parking lot. I would not let him win. I would trace every single hidden account. I would secure the indisputable medical evidence of his paternity. I would wait for the exact moment he felt the most untouchable, the most arrogant, and the most victorious. And then I would tear his entire world apart. The tears were gone. The cold, calculating survival instinct had completely clicked on. The drive from the deserted strip mall to the sprawling gated community where my mother-in-law lived took exactly 22 minutes. Every single second of that drive felt like an eternity of agonizing confusion. I gripped the leather steering wheel of my sedan so tightly that my knuckles turned completely white, my mind desperately trying to process the absolute slaughter of my life. Liam had drained our accounts. He had publicly humiliated me. He had weaponized our entire church community against me. But in the midst of this terrifying freefall, my traumatized brain clung to one final, desperate lifeline. I believed with all my heart that I could seek refuge with his mother, Patricia. Patricia was the formidable matriarch of the family, a woman who prided herself on her deep Christian values and her pristine reputation in our affluent suburban town. For the past 3 years, she had called me her very own daughter. We had spent countless Sunday afternoons baking pies together for the church charity drives. She had held my hand just last month, crying tears of joy when we showed her the first ultrasound pictures of her future grandson. I genuinely believed that if I could just reach her, if I could just stand in her grand foyer and tell her what Liam had done, she would be absolutely horrified. I thought she would wrap her arms around me, call her son, and demand an immediate end to this horrific nightmare. I drove through the massive iron gates of her exclusive neighborhood, completely blind to the fact that I was actively walking right into the center of the viper's nest. I pulled my car onto the circular cobblestone driveway and threw it into park. My pregnant belly felt incredibly heavy, and a dull, throbbing ache had settled deeply into my lower back. I stumbled up the wide brick steps to the massive double oak doors of her estate. My breath came in shallow, ragged gasps as I pressed the glowing brass doorbell. The familiar chimes echoed deep within the quiet, cavernous house. I wrapped my arms protectively around my stomach, shivering in the heavy summer heat, waiting for the warm, familiar embrace of the woman I trusted. The heavy oak door clicked and slowly swung open. Patricia stood in the doorway. She was impeccably dressed in a tailored beige silk twin set, her silver hair perfectly coiffed and her signature pearl necklace resting against her collarbone. But the moment my tear-swollen eyes met hers, an icy, terrifying chill ran violently down my spine. There was absolutely no shock on her face. There was no maternal warmth. There was no confusion. Her pale blue eyes were entirely flat cold and utterly devoid of any human empathy. She did not open her arms to comfort me. She did not step aside to let me into the air-conditioned comfort of her home. Instead, she stood squarely in the exact center of the threshold, planting her expensive leather shoes firmly on the polished marble floor of the foyer, creating an impenetrable physical barrier. "Patricia, please," I choked out, my voice breaking into a pathetic, desperate sob. Liam has completely lost his mind. He stood up at the church potluck and told everyone he is sterile. He accused me of terrible things. He drained our bank accounts and kicked me out. You have to talk to him. You have to tell him this baby is his son. Patricia did not blink. She looked at my tear-stained face, and then her cold gaze slowly dropped to my swollen abdomen. The corner of her mouth twitched upward into a look of absolute, unadulterated disgust. She raised one perfectly manicured hand, silencing my desperate pleas with a single dismissive gesture. "Stop making a disgraceful scene on my front porch, Caroline," Patricia said. Her voice was incredibly calm, measured, and dripping with a chillingly polite venom. "You are embarrassing yourself." I froze. My mouth fell slightly open as my brain completely failed to process her cruel tone. I tried to take a step forward into the foyer, but she rigidly held her ground. "I am not making a scene," I whispered, fresh tears spilling over my eyelashes. "Patricia, I have absolutely nowhere to go. My debit cards are declining. He took everything. Please, I just need to come inside and sit down for a moment." "You will not be coming inside," Patricia replied smoothly. She turned slightly and reached toward the antique mahogany console table positioned just inside the grand entryway. She picked up a thick, crisp manila envelope. She turned back to me and held the envelope out, pushing it directly into my chest with a firm, unforgiving pressure. I took the envelope with shaking, clumsy fingers. My heart was pounding so hard against my ribs that I felt physically dizzy. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the sound of the blood rushing in my ears. "That is a postnuptial relinquishment of marital assets," Patricia stated, her voice echoing coldly in the grand marble space. Liam's lawyers drafted it very carefully. It explicitly states that you completely waive your right to any financial support, alimony, or claim to the properties and investment portfolios. Inside that envelope, you will also find a certified cashier's check made out to you for exactly $5,000. I stared down at the thick legal packet in my trembling hands, my mind completely spinning into a dark, terrifying abyss. A pre-drafted legal document. A certified cashier's check. This meant Patricia knew exactly what was going to happen today. She had known for weeks. The beloved mother-in-law who had kissed my cheek and prayed over my unborn child had been actively sitting in high-rise law offices, coldly plotting my absolute financial slaughter. $5,000. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my dry mouth. Patricia. I gave up my teaching career for this family. I poured nearly $100,000 of my own savings into Liam's firm. $5,000 will not even cover a month of rent and medical bills for this baby. Patricia let out a short, cynical laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. You are severely overestimating your value to this family, Caroline. You were always just a high school history teacher, a temporary placeholder with a mediocre pedigree. You brought absolutely no real wealth or social capital into my son's life. We simply allowed you to play house until a better opportunity presented itself. She took a deliberate step forward, her pale blue eyes narrowing into slits of pure malice. Take the $5,000, Caroline. Sign the paperwork. Use a fraction of that money to go to a quiet clinic in the city and permanently get rid of that unfortunate burden you are carrying in your belly. When you are done, take whatever is left and disappear back to whatever boring middle-class life you came from. If you attempt to fight my son in court, we will completely destroy you. We will ensure the judge sees you exactly as the church sees you today. A manipulative, cheating fraud. The sheer magnitude of her evil hit me with the force of a freight train. She was standing in the doorway of her beautiful Christian home, calmly instructing me to terminate my pregnancy and walk away from my own life for $5,000. The agonizing, desperate sorrow that had been entirely consuming my body for the past 2 hours suddenly hit a massive, impenetrable wall. My tears completely stopped. The violent trembling in my hands ceased instantly, as I stood there staring into the soulless eyes of the woman I had once loved like a mother. A bright musical sound suddenly drifted through the heavy air of the grand house. It was the distinct melodic sound of a young woman laughing. I shifted my gaze past Patricia's shoulder. To her left, at the end of the long marble hallway, the heavy French doors leading into the formal parlor were left slightly ajar. Through the narrow gap, I could clearly see the interior of the opulent room. Sitting comfortably on the expensive velvet sofa was Savannah, the 24-year-old daughter of the most powerful real estate developer in our congregation. She was wearing a stunning tailored white sundress, her blonde hair perfectly styled. She was holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne, throwing her head back in delighted laughter. Standing right beside the velvet sofa, pouring another glass of champagne, was Thomas, Liam's younger brother. Thomas was smiling brightly, leaning down to whisper something charming into Savannah's ear. At that exact moment, a sudden draft from the air conditioning vent blew through the cracked parlor doors and swept straight down the hallway into the foyer. The draft carried a very specific, undeniable scent directly into my face. It was the sharp, sickly sweet stench of cheap vanilla and jasmine perfume. The exact same perfume that had been clinging heavily to my husband's lapel just 2 hours ago at the church potluck. The entire massive, terrifying conspiracy slammed together in my mind with absolute crystal-clear perfection. Savannah was the sole heiress to a commercial real estate empire worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Her family's trust fund was legendary in our social circle. Liam's wealth management firm had been aggressively trying to secure her father's massive corporate accounts for over a year, but Savannah's father was notoriously traditional. He only did business with family. He only trusted men who were firmly embedded in his inner circle. Patricia and Liam did not just want to have an affair with Savannah. They wanted to marry her. They wanted total, unrestricted access to the real estate trust fund to elevate their own social and financial standing. But Liam was already married to me. He could not simply divorce his pregnant, completely devoted wife without looking like an absolute monster. If Liam had initiated a normal, unprovoked divorce, Savannah's strictly religious father would have completely cut ties with his firm out of sheer moral disgust. The church community would have rallied around me, the abandoned pregnant teacher, and Liam would have lost his entire client base. They needed a bulletproof excuse. They needed to make Liam look like a tragic, heartbroken victim. So Patricia and Liam fabricated the sterility report. They orchestrated the public confrontation at the church potluck to perfectly control the narrative. By framing me as a deceitful, unfaithful woman carrying a bastard child, Liam instantly gained the absolute sympathy of the entire congregation. Savannah's father would view Liam as a deeply wronged, honorable Christian man who desperately needed a fresh start. Savannah was already waiting in the parlor, sipping champagne, fully integrated into the family, completely ready to step into the tragic void I supposedly created. This was not a messy, emotional affair. This was a hostile corporate takeover of my marriage. They had systematically drained my bank accounts so I could not afford legal representation. They had weaponized my pregnancy to destroy my reputation. They had perfectly engineered a financial slaughter to steal Savannah's trust fund, and they expected me to quietly accept $5,000 and disappear into the night like a frightened, beaten dog. I looked back at Patricia. She was still holding her arrogant, triumphant posture, waiting for me to break down crying again. She expected me to collapse onto the porch sign, the papers through my tears, and walk away entirely defeated. She vastly underestimated the woman standing in front of her. The agonizing pain of a broken heart entirely vanished from my chest. It was instantly replaced by a freezing, calculated, terrifying survival instinct. I was no longer a discarded wife pleading for mercy from her cruel mother-in-law. I was a senior forensic accountant who had just been handed the exact blueprint of her enemy's corporate fraud. I looked down at the thick legal envelope in my hands. I did not throw it back at her. I did not scream. I did not make a single emotional sound. I calmly opened my leather purse and slid the manila envelope safely inside. This document was not my surrender. It was my first piece of hard, tangible evidence. It was documented proof of their premeditated coercion and financial abuse. I looked Patricia directly in the eyes. My gaze was so incredibly cold and devoid of fear that I actually saw a brief flicker of uncertainty cross her heavily powdered face. "You can keep your $5,000, Patricia," I said. My voice was no longer a pathetic, trembling whisper. It was smooth, dark, and as sharp as a diamond cutting through glass. "I suggest you hold on to it tightly. You are going to need every single penny to pay for your defense attorneys when I am absolutely finished with this family." Patricia opened her mouth to snap a cruel retort, but I did not give her the satisfaction of hearing it. I turned my back on her entirely. I walked down the brick steps with a perfectly steady, unhurried posture. I did not look back as she slammed the heavy oak door shut behind me. I walked to my car, opened the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I started the engine, feeling a dark, powerful energy radiating through every single nerve in my body. They thought they had left me with nothing but a ruined reputation and a tragic future. But they had carelessly given me the one thing they could never defend against. They had given me absolute clarity. The tears were gone forever. The war had officially begun, and I was going to burn their entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. I drove until the fuel gauge on my sedan dipped dangerously close to empty. The affluent suburban streets of my former life slowly faded into the gritty industrial outskirts of the city. The perfectly manicured lawns and grand colonial homes were replaced by abandoned warehouses and chain-link fences. I pulled into the cracked asphalt parking lot of a cheap roadside motel. The neon sign above the office buzzed loudly. It flickered a harsh red light against the darkening evening sky. I paid for 3 nights in cash using a small emergency stash I had kept hidden in my glove compartment for years. I absolutely refused to touch the $5,000 cashier check Patricia had shoved into my chest. That piece of paper was my physical proof of their coercion. I guarded it in my purse like a loaded weapon. The motel room smelled of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpeting, and harsh industrial bleach. I locked the flimsy wooden door. I slid the rusted chain into place and collapsed onto the edge of the sagging mattress. My lower back throbbed with a dull, relentless ache. The 24-week pregnant belly I carried felt incredibly heavy. I placed my hands on my stomach. I felt the baby kick against my palms. It was a strong, reassuring movement that grounded me in this terrifying new reality. I was entirely alone. I had no home, no career, and no friends to call. The church community had completely shunned me. But as I sat in that freezing damp room, staring at the peeling floral wallpaper, I did not shed a single tear. The searing agony of my broken heart had been entirely replaced by a freezing, calculated survival instinct. I needed cash. I needed it immediately. I opened my leather tote bag and dumped the contents onto the faded bedspread. I was desperately searching for anything I could pawn or sell to survive the coming days. My hands sifted through the meager belongings I had managed to grab before fleeing the church potluck. A tube of lipstick, a pack of prenatal vitamins, my wallet with declined debit cards, and a heavy rectangular object wrapped in an old scarf. I pulled away the fabric and stared at it. It was an old backup tablet. Liam had casually discarded it into my junk drawer over 8 months ago when he upgraded to a newer, sleeker model. He told me the battery was shot and the screen was too scratched to be useful for his high-profile wealth management meetings. He instructed me to throw it away, but my frugal habits from my days as a high school history teacher had prevented me from tossing a perfectly functional piece of technology. I had tossed it into my tote bag weeks ago, intending to drop it off at an electronics recycling bin. Now it was my only potential source of fast cash. I picked up the device. The glass screen was cold against my fingertips. I pressed the power button. I held my breath, praying that the battery held some residual charge. The screen remained dark for a terrifyingly long moment before the white logo suddenly materialized in the center of the black glass. It took nearly 3 full minutes for the outdated operating system to boot up. The battery icon in the top right corner flashed red. It showed exactly 9% life remaining. I quickly grabbed the charging cable from my bag and plugged it into the loose wall outlet near the nightstand. I sat back on the bed staring at the screen. The device was not passcode protected. Liam had wiped his primary profile from it months ago, or at least he assumed he had. I navigated to the settings menu. I was searching for the factory reset option so I could wipe it completely clean before taking it to a pawn shop the next morning. But to perform a factory reset, the device required an internet connection. I tapped on the wireless network icon and selected the unsecured free guest network provided by the motel. The loading circle spun lazily for a few seconds before a small blue checkmark appeared. The tablet was officially connected to the internet. What happened next completely altered the entire trajectory of my life. The moment the old tablet established a connection to the unsecured motel network, a sharp, piercing chime echoed through the quiet, damp room. Then another chime, and another. The device suddenly began to vibrate violently in my hands. A massive, relentless flood of digital notifications cascaded down the lock screen. Hundreds of alerts, then thousands piling up with terrifying speed. My heart hammered against my ribs. I stared at the screen in absolute shock. Liam had removed his primary user profile, but he had made a fatal, incredibly arrogant technological mistake. He had forgotten to sign out of his primary cloud storage account. The old tablet was now aggressively syncing 8 months of backlogged data directly from his current phone and his private corporate laptop. The notifications were coming from a hidden encrypted messaging application and a secure offshore banking portal. I watched the numbers climb. My breath caught in my throat. 500 messages, 1,000 files, 2,000 documents. The digital ghost of my husband's treacherous life was rapidly downloading straight into my hands. I did not panic. I did not cry. My analytical brain immediately took absolute control. I grabbed my reading glasses from my purse. I slid them onto my face and tapped the green messaging icon. The application opened, revealing a lengthy, highly active chat log with a single contact name saved simply as Savannah. I clicked on the thread. The visceral, sickening exchanges between my husband and the 24-year-old real estate heiress illuminated the dark motel room. I began to read from the very beginning. I traced the exact timeline of their disgusting affair. The messages from 6 months ago perfectly coincided with the exact week I had happily surprised Liam with the news of my pregnancy. Liam wrote, "Savannah, my love. I cannot stand another night in this boring house with her. She told me she is pregnant today. It makes me physically sick. I am looking at her right now, and all I can think about is your beautiful face." Savannah replied, "Oh my God, Liam, that is so gross. You promised me you were going to leave that frumpy teacher." "I am not waiting around forever." My father wants to introduce me to a corporate lawyer next week. Liam wrote back instantly. Do not go near anyone else, Savannah. You are mine. I'm already moving the money. I just need a little more time to set up the perfect exit. I'm going to make sure she looks like an absolute monster, so your father welcomes me with open arms. We will be sipping champagne in the Mediterranean by next summer. I promise you, my queen. I read message after message. My blood turned into absolute ice. They openly mocked my changing pregnant body. They laughed about how gullible and trusting I was when Liam lied about working late. Savannah constantly complained about her wealthy father, demanding that Liam prove his devotion by buying her increasingly lavish gifts. She was incredibly entitled, cruel, and completely devoid of any moral compass. But the most horrifying messages were not the romantic ones. They were the ones where Liam detailed his precise, methodical plan to destroy me. He wrote to her last month. Savannah, I fabricated the medical records today. The sterility report looks absolutely flawless. I paid a private clinic in the city $5,000 under the table to forge the doctor's signature. Tomorrow, I will drop the bomb at the church potluck. The entire congregation will turn on her instantly. She will have absolutely no money, no friends, and no credibility. Your father will see me as a tragic, honorable victim. Savannah replied, Liam, you are an absolute genius. I love you so much. Did you secure the boat yet? I stopped breathing. The boat. My mind raced back to the $15,000 withdrawal I had seen on my phone earlier that afternoon, the one labeled as a luxury maritime retainer. I closed the messaging application and opened the synced cloud storage drive. I needed to see exactly where the rest of our money had gone. I tapped on a folder simply titled Offshore Portfolios. The folder contained dozens of highly complex, heavily encrypted financial spreadsheets. As a former high school history teacher, I had never dealt with international corporate finance. But as a desperate, cornered mother fighting for her survival, I possessed an unmatched ability to learn and connect the dots. I spent the next 4 hours sitting on that sagging motel bed, poring over every single document, every wire transfer receipt, and every hidden ledger. Liam had not just drained our joint savings account. The $200,000 he stole from me was merely a drop in the bucket. I opened a master ledger and discovered the true staggering scope of his crimes. Liam was the primary wealth manager for our entire affluent church community. He handled the retirement funds for the church elders, the charity endowments, and the massive building fund meant for the new community center. He was a trusted pillar of the congregation. Everyone blindly handed him their money. I cross-referenced the church fund accounts with Liam hidden offshore portfolios in the Cayman Islands. The numbers perfectly mirrored each other. He had been quietly, systematically embezzling millions of dollars from the very church community that had just shunned me. He was skimming massive amounts of cash from the charity endowments, routing the money through complex shell companies registered under Savannah's name, and depositing the clean laundered funds into his private offshore accounts. I opened a document labeled Caribbean Purchase Agreement. It was a finalized bill of sale for a 60-foot luxury yacht. The purchase price was $2.5 million. The buyer was listed as Savannah Shell Company. The funds had been wired directly from the embezzled church charity accounts. He was using the stolen money from the devout, judgmental congregation to buy his young mistress a luxury yacht for their planned escape. The sheer magnitude of his absolute hypocrisy left me breathless. The men and women who had looked at me with pure disgust this afternoon, who had parted like the Red Sea to cast me out as a filthy sinner, were actively being robbed blind by the man they viewed as an honorable, tragic martyr. He was stealing their life savings, their charity money, their retirement funds, and using it to finance a lavish international getaway with a 24-year-old heiress. He had built his entire pristine reputation on a mountain of fraudulent lies, and he was completely willing to sacrifice my life and my unborn child to maintain that perfect facade. I sat perfectly still in the freezing, damp motel room. The glowing screen of the tablet cast a pale blue light across my face. The agonizing, suffocating pain of my broken marriage was completely eradicated. I did not feel a single shred of sorrow for the loss of my husband. I only felt a terrifying, absolute clarity. Liam thought he had executed the perfect crime. He thought he had left me utterly defenseless, financially ruined, and socially destroyed. He thought I was just a naive, weak woman who would disappear into the night and never look back. He was incredibly wrong. He had carelessly handed me the exact keys to his entire destruction. I now possessed the undisputed digital proof of his adultery, his forged medical documents, his offshore shell companies, and his multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. I slowly closed the protective cover over the tablet. I wrapped the device carefully in the old scarf and placed it securely into my leather tote bag. The tears were completely gone. The cold, calculating survival instinct firmly clicked into place. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of his impending absolute ruin. I would trace every single fraudulent transfer. I would copy every malicious text message. I would expose the vile, rotten core of his entire existence. The man who had publicly destroyed my name and tried to erase my unborn son was about to face a reckoning he could never possibly imagine. The pieces were all in my hands now, and I knew exactly how to play the final move. My mind raced with the thrilling prospect of utter, total justice. I would ensure that every single person who had blindly trusted him would soon see exactly what kind of monster he truly was. I was ready for war. I sat cross-legged on the sagging mattress of the cheap roadside motel. The flickering red neon sign outside my window cast a harsh, bloody glow across the thin, peeling floral wallpaper. I did not sleep. I could not sleep. My mind was entirely consumed by the digital goldmine sitting on my lap. The old backup tablet Liam had carelessly discarded was plugged into the frayed wall outlet. I had gone down to the dingy motel lobby and taken a thick stack of cheap branded notepads and 4 blue ballpoint pens. I spread them out across the faded bedspread, creating a makeshift war room. I was a former high school history teacher. For years, I had taught advanced research methods to my students. I knew exactly how to sift through decades of complex historical archives to find the absolute truth. I was now applying those exact same meticulous research skills to completely dismantle my treacherous husband. My pregnant belly ached with a dull, heavy pressure, but the pure adrenaline pumping through my veins completely masked my physical exhaustion. I took a deep, steadying breath and plunged back into the encrypted folders on the tablet. I started my deep dive with the massive church community accounts. Liam had always bragged about managing the retirement funds for the church elders, the charity endowments, and the massive building fund meant for the new youth center. Everyone in our affluent congregation blindly handed him their money because he played the part of the devoted, honorable Christian man to absolute perfection. I opened his master financial spreadsheet, and my blood immediately turned to ice. Liam had categorized the massive monthly withdrawals from the church accounts as secure domestic bond investments. But when I cross-referenced the routing numbers on his synced screen, I found a terrifyingly complex web of deliberate deceit. He had set up a series of domestic limited liability companies using Savannah and her wealthy family real estate connections to mask the trail. He named one shell company, Crescent Maritime, and another, Apex Horizon Holdings. I copied the tax identification numbers onto my notepad and ran them through the state business registry using the unsecured motel wireless network. The result appeared instantly on the glowing screen. The registered agent for every single fraudulent entity was a private wealth attorney located in Miami. I mapped out the exact flow of the embezzled money with my cheap blue pen. First, Liam transferred the church charity endowments and the community center building funds into his legitimate corporate brokerage accounts. He labeled them on the official statements as routine asset reallocations to avoid raising any immediate red flags with the church finance committee. Then he aggressively filtered the cash through multiple dummy accounts to completely wash the digital fingerprints. Finally, the clean laundered money was wired directly into his private offshore portfolios in the Cayman Islands. I wrote down every single transaction date. I matched the exact routing numbers to the corresponding shell companies. My pen flew across the motel notepad, creating a flawless, undeniable map of his federal wire fraud. The sheer scale of his theft was absolutely staggering. He had stolen over $4 million from the devout, trusting congregation who had just publicly condemned me. The deeper I dug into the digital ledgers, the more sickening his arrogant calculations became. I found digital copies of the forged financial reports he intended to present to the church board. He had perfectly manipulated the spreadsheets to make the missing millions look like devastating stock market losses caused by recent economic downturns. But his private encrypted notes revealed the absolute truth. He was systematically bleeding our entire community dry to fund an obscenely lavish lifestyle with his 24-year-old mistress. I found the finalized bill of sale for the luxury yacht I had seen referenced in his bank transfers. The purchase price was $2.5 million. The buyer was explicitly listed as Savannah Personal Shell Company. The funds had been wired directly from the embezzled church charity accounts. He was using the stolen money from the very people who had shunned me to buy his young mistress a luxury yacht for their planned escape. I also found the property deed for a massive oceanfront villa located in Belize. Belize was a country with notoriously complicated extradition treaties with the United States. He was not just buying luxury assets to show off his wealth. He was actively purchasing a permanent, untraceable escape route. The sheer magnitude of his absolute hypocrisy left me entirely breathless. He had sat in the front pew of our church every single Sunday, holding my hand and bowing his head in prayer while actively plotting to rob the elderly congregation blind. Then I found the most horrifying document of all. It was tucked away in a hidden subfolder labeled Contingency. I tapped on the file and the blood completely drained from my face. It was a forged legal document bearing a near-perfect imitation of my own handwriting. Liam had drafted a fake power of attorney, granting me unilateral access to the church investment funds. Alongside the forged legal document were fabricated bank statements linking my personal debit card to an illegal offshore gambling site. I read the fraudulent documents with a growing, terrifying clarity. He was not just going to divorce me and leave me penniless on the street. He was actively planning to frame me for his entire multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. I switched back to the messaging application and opened his chat log with Savannah to confirm my terrifying suspicions. I scrolled down to the most recent messages sent just 2 days ago. The words on the screen confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. Liam wrote to her, "Savannah, my queen. The church board just scheduled their mandatory annual financial audit for the 15th of next month. That gives us exactly 3 weeks to finalize everything. The yacht is fully stocked and waiting in the Miami Marina. We fly out on the 12th. Savannah replied almost immediately, "I cannot wait, Liam. I am so tired of sneaking around. Are you absolutely sure the audit will not trace the missing money back to my family trust fund? My father would kill me if he found out." Liam answered her with disgusting, arrogant confidence. "I am positive, my love. I have already planted the forged gambling debts on Caroline's personal computer at the house. When the church elders discover the missing $4 million, they will find the digital trail leading straight to her. She is already a disgraced, cheating outcast in the eyes of the entire congregation. The police will easily believe she stole the money to fund a secret double life. We will be drinking expensive champagne on our balcony in Belize before the federal authorities even issue a warrant for her arrest." I sat perfectly still in the freezing damp motel room. The glowing screen of the tablet cast a pale blue light across my face. The agonizing, suffocating pain of my broken marriage was completely eradicated. I did not feel a single shred of sorrow for the loss of my husband. I only felt a terrifying, absolute clarity. Liam thought he had executed the perfect, flawless crime. He thought he had left me utterly defenseless, financially ruined, and socially destroyed. He thought I was just a naive, weak woman who would disappear into the night and eventually take the fall for his massive federal crimes. He needed an unassailable excuse to completely discard me while keeping every single penny of the substantial wealth he had stolen. By framing me as a shameless adulteress and proudly claiming complete lifelong sterility, he ensured that the religious community would entirely shun me. He ensured the local courts would offer me zero sympathy. But he had made one fatal, incredibly arrogant miscalculation. He forgot that before I spent my evenings ironing his expensive suits and cooking his gourmet meals, I was a highly educated woman with a deeply analytical mind. He had carelessly handed me the exact keys to his entire destruction. I now possessed the undisputed digital proof of his adultery, his forged medical documents, his offshore shell companies, and his multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. I slowly closed the protective cover over the tablet. I wrapped the device carefully in the old scarf and placed it securely into my leather tote bag. The tears were completely gone. The cold, calculating survival instinct firmly clicked into place. I was no longer a victim. I was the architect of his impending, absolute ruin. The clock was ticking. I had exactly 3 weeks before the church audit. I had exactly 3 weeks before Liam and Savannah boarded a plane to Miami and vanished into the Caribbean forever. If I did not act with absolute precision, he would successfully escape to a non-extradition country, and I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison for a crime I did not commit. He had deliberately labeled my innocent, unborn son as a filthy bastard to secure his own victimhood. He had plotted to completely destroy my future to secure his own luxurious getaway. I gathered my handwritten notes and stacked them neatly on the small wooden desk. I mapped out the exact timeline of his impending escape. I highlighted the date of the upcoming church audit. I circled the date of his planned flight to Miami. Every single piece of his fraudulent, treacherous life was laid out before me in perfect chronological order. I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not simply take this information to the local police. Liam was incredibly wealthy and deeply connected in our town. He would use his high-priced lawyers to drag out the investigation while he quietly slipped out of the country. I needed to build a trap so completely inescapable that he would not even realize he was caught until the steel bars slammed shut around him. I needed a federal intervention. I needed the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation to completely lock down his assets before he ever stepped foot on that airplane. I needed to meticulously verify every single fraudulent wire transfer. I needed to ensure that Savannah's powerful family was dragged directly into the center of the scandal, so they could not use their immense wealth to protect him. I looked down at my pregnant belly and placed my hand firmly against my child. I promised my unborn son that his father would absolutely pay for every single thing he had done. I would trace every single hidden account. I would secure the indisputable medical evidence of his paternity. I would wait for the exact moment he felt the most untouchable, the most arrogant, and the most victorious. And then I would tear his entire world apart. The morning light began to filter through the thin curtains of the motel room. The harsh red glow of the neon sign finally faded into the pale dawn. I had not slept a single minute, but I had never felt more awake in my entire life. I picked up my blue pen and wrote down the name of the most ruthless corporate attorney in the city. I was ready to begin my counterattack. The silent, submissive wife was dead. The cold, calculating survivor had officially taken absolute control. I stared at the name I had just written on the cheap motel notepad. Victoria Vance. She was a silver-haired legal shark known for completely dismantling fraudulent corporate executives in federal court. I knew I needed someone with her exact level of ruthless expertise to help me navigate the incoming storm. Liam thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a defenseless opponent. He truly believed he had already achieved total victory. He believed his meticulously crafted lies had permanently secured his wealth and his freedom. He believed his cruel public performance at the church potluck had broken my spirit so entirely that I would quietly accept my tragic fate. He did not realize that his arrogance had blinded him to his own fatal errors. He had severely underestimated my intelligence. He had severely underestimated a mother's desperate need to protect her unborn child. He had handed me the loaded weapon of his own digital confession. The 3-week countdown had officially begun. I gathered my notes, my pens, and the concealed tablet. I placed them all securely into my leather bag. I stood up from the sagging motel mattress. My back ached and my pregnant belly felt incredibly heavy, but my posture was perfectly straight. I walked into the small, cramped bathroom and washed my face with cold water. I looked at my reflection in the stained mirror. The woman looking back at me was ready for absolute total war. I would not shed another tear for Liam. I would only focus on his complete, inevitable destruction. The walls of the cheap, damp motel room seemed to rapidly close in on me. I had spent hours sitting cross-legged on the sagging mattress, staring at the glowing screen of the old backup tablet. Every single fraudulent transaction and every sickening text message between Liam and Savannah was permanently burned into my memory. My mind was racing with complex plans for federal injunctions and absolute corporate ruin, but my physical body was completely collapsing under the crushing weight of the trauma. A sudden sharp cramp seized my lower abdomen with terrifying violence. I gasped aloud and dropped my blue pen onto the faded bedspread. I desperately thought it was just a severe physical stress response to the horrifying discoveries I had just made. I took a deep, shaky breath and tried to stand up from the bed, but a second cramp hit me with the absolute force of a sledgehammer. It was a blinding, agonizing pain that instantly forced me to my knees. A warm, sudden rush of fluid soaked entirely through my clothes and pooled on the damp, stained carpet. Pure, absolute terror flooded my veins and paralyzed my lungs. I was only 24 weeks pregnant. It was far too early. The immense psychological torture and the devastating financial ambush of the past 24 hours had pushed my body past its absolute breaking point. I was actively going into premature labor. I dragged my shaking body up from the dirty floor. I grabbed my heavy leather tote bag containing the tablet and my meticulously handwritten notes. I knew I could not call an ambulance. I was completely terrified that Liam had powerful connections in this town and people actively watching the local emergency dispatches. If he found out I was in the hospital, he would send his lawyers to finish destroying me. I stumbled out of the dark motel room and threw myself into the driver's seat of my sedan. The night air was incredibly thick and suffocating. I started the engine and drove out of the cracked asphalt parking lot. Every single bump in the road sent fresh, terrifying waves of excruciating pain radiating directly up my spine. I gripped the steering wheel with white-hot knuckles. I prayed out loud to a God I desperately hoped was still listening to me. I begged and pleaded for my innocent baby to survive this nightmare. I sped through the dark, deserted suburban streets, running 2 consecutive red lights. The bright, glowing red sign of the county hospital emergency room finally appeared in the distance, like a brilliant beacon in the pitch-black night. I slammed my foot on the brakes and abandoned my car right in the middle of the ambulance bay. I stumbled through the automatic sliding glass doors and collapsed heavily against the reception desk. The triage nurses took one look at my pale, sweating face and the blood soaking my clothes. The sterile quiet of the waiting room instantly erupted into organized, frantic chaos. I was swiftly lifted onto a rolling gurney. Bright fluorescent lights flashed rapidly above my head as they rushed me down the long, endless white corridors. My heart hammered against my ribs with a deafening, terrifying rhythm. I was completely alone, surrounded by shouting medical professionals. I heard a nurse urgently call for Dr. Harrison, the chief attending neonatologist. Dr. Harrison was a tall, authoritative man with kind gray eyes. He rushed into the trauma bay and immediately took absolute control of the room. He ordered a massive dose of medication to try and stop the violent contractions, but it was entirely too late. My traumatized body was completely rejecting the pregnancy. The pain was an absolute consuming fire that burned through every nerve in my body. I squeezed my eyes tightly shut and pushed with every last ounce of strength I possessed. I pushed for the tiny, innocent life that Liam had so casually and cruelly discarded. I pushed to bring my son into the world so I could fiercely protect him from the monsters who wanted him entirely erased. The delivery was a grueling, terrifying blur of sheer agony and loudly screaming medical monitors. And then suddenly, the intense physical pain stopped. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the bright trauma room for 2 agonizing, endless seconds. Then, I heard it. A tiny, weak, fragile cry pierced the quiet air. It was the most beautiful, miraculous sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I burst into exhausted, deeply grateful tears. Dr. Harrison held up a tiny, perfect baby boy before rushing him directly to a specialized neonatal intensive care unit incubator. The nurses told me he was incredibly small, but he was fighting very hard. I fell back against the crisp hospital pillows, utterly drained but fiercely alive. I lay in the sterile recovery room for hours. My physical body was completely broken, but my mind was incredibly sharp and hyper-vigilant. The heavy leather tote bag containing Liam's digital confession rested safely under my hospital bed. I kept my hand draped over the edge of the mattress, making sure the bag was still there. I was desperately waiting for news about my son. The heavy wooden door finally opened, and Dr. Harrison walked into the room. His kind gray eyes were heavily shadowed with deep professional concern. He did not smile. My maternal survival instinct instantly flared to life. I sat straight up, completely ignoring the sharp shooting pain in my core. "Caroline, I need you to listen to me very carefully," Dr. Harrison said softly but firmly. "Your son is stable for the moment, but we have encountered a highly critical medical complication. He was born with a very rare, severe hemolytic blood disorder. His red blood cells are rapidly breaking down. He absolutely needs a highly specialized targeted blood transfusion and a specific bone marrow protein treatment to survive the next 48 hours. I felt the warm blood drain entirely from my face. My breath caught sharply in my throat. "Tell me exactly what to do," I pleaded, my voice shaking with raw, unfiltered desperation. "Take my blood. Take whatever you need from my body. Please just save my baby." Dr. Harrison placed a gentle, reassuring hand on my trembling shoulder. "We have already tested your blood, Caroline. Unfortunately, your specific genetic markers do not carry the necessary antibodies for this exact specialized treatment protocol. We absolutely must have a direct paternal match. The biological father genetic makeup is the only viable source to synthesize the specific treatment your son needs right now. We need you to call your husband immediately. We need Liam here to draw a sample tonight." The name hit me like a violent physical blow to the chest. Liam. The man who had stood in a crowded churchyard and proudly declared he was completely sterile since birth. The man who had thrown a fake medical folder in my face and publicly branded my baby as a filthy bastard. A massive wave of absolute pure panic washed over me. "Dr. Harrison." I choked out the hot tears welling rapidly in my eyes. "You do not understand. My husband threw me out yesterday afternoon. He publicly announced to our entire community that he is sterile. He vehemently claims this baby is not his. He presented a medical file proving he has a 0 sperm count. If I call him, he will not come to this hospital. He will just laugh at me and let my son die." Dr. Harrison stared at me in absolute stunned silence. He looked down at my medical chart and then back up at my terrified face. His brow furrowed in deep professional confusion and rising anger. "Sterile," he repeated slowly, testing the word. "Caroline, a man who is completely sterile since birth, absolutely does not father a child. It is biologically completely impossible. And I am looking at your blood work and the infant genetic markers right now. I can easily run an emergency rapid genetic panel comparing the baby DNA against the specific paternal haplogroup markers. We need to synthesize the treatment. We can definitively legally prove the biological lineage within 3 hours. I just need your official consent to expedite the highest level genetic sequencing." "Do it," I said, my voice suddenly dropping an entire octave. "Run the test, Dr. Harrison. Run the test right now." The next 3 hours were an absolute agonizing eternity. I sat completely alone in the quiet hospital room, staring at the blank white wall. My mind raced through 1,000 terrifying scenarios. Had I somehow made a terrible mistake? Was it possible the clinic made a massive error? No, I knew the absolute, undeniable truth. I had never touched another man. I knew with every single fiber of my being that Liam was the biological father. The sterility was a complete lie. It was a massive, calculated, theatrical lie designed entirely to destroy my reputation and clear the path for Savannah and her multi-million-dollar trust fund. Just before dawn, the heavy wooden door to my room clicked open. Dr. Harrison walked in holding a thick sealed laboratory folder. His face was a mask of cold, hard scientific certainty. He walked directly to my bed and handed me the folder. I expedited the results through our secure forensic laboratory. Dr. Harrison stated, his voice echoing clearly in the silent room. The genetic sequencing is absolute and completely undeniable. The paternal markers are a flawless exact match to the genetic profile required from the biological father. I ran the complex probability matrix twice to be absolutely certain there were no errors. I opened the folder with incredibly steady, unyielding hands. My eyes scanned the complex scientific data. The bold black letters, printed at the very bottom of the official hospital report, jumped off the page and burned into my retinas. Probability of paternity, 99.99%. A freezing, terrifying chill ran violently down my spine. The truth was not just a dark suspicion anymore. It was a certified legal medical fact. Liam was absolutely, undoubtedly the biological father of my son. He was never sterile. The medical folder he threw at me in front of the entire church congregation was a complete, total fabrication. Patricia and Liam had actively, maliciously forged medical documents to frame me for adultery. They had orchestrated an elaborate, cruel public execution of my character based on a lie so profound and so deeply evil that it literally took my breath away. They were completely willing to let me walk away in absolute disgrace, bearing the lifelong, devastating shame of a cheater just so he could secure his new wealthy bride without any moral backlash from the church. He lied. I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly loud and powerful in the quiet room. He completely lied to everyone. Dr. Harrison nodded, his expression grim and deeply supportive. The medical evidence is completely indisputable, Caroline. This document is certified by the state laboratory. It is an official legal record. Now that we have the exact genetic map, we need to request the specific donor proteins from the National Registry to save your son. We do not need your treacherous husband to come in. We can easily source the match through the central blood bank using this verified data. Your baby is going to survive. A massive, overwhelming wave of profound relief washed over my exhausted body. My innocent son was going to live, but the immense relief was instantly swallowed by a dark, rising tide of absolute righteous fury. Liam had not just tried to steal my money and absolutely destroy my reputation. He had used a massive lie that could have literally prevented my son from receiving life-saving medical treatment. He was completely willing to let his own biological child perish just to miraculously maintain his flawless, pristine public image. I stared down at the official certified DNA report in my hands. The heavy paper felt incredibly powerful. This was not just a standard medical document. This was my absolute salvation. This was the irrefutable, undeniable proof that would completely dismantle his entire false narrative. Liam truly thought his fake sterility report was his ultimate impenetrable shield. He thought he had completely trapped me in a dark corner where I could never possibly defend myself against his accusations. He had absolutely no idea that I was currently holding the exact devastating weapon needed to completely destroy him. I carefully folded the certified DNA report. I reached under my hospital bed and pulled out my heavy leather tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment and slid the crisp, white laboratory document right next to the old backup tablet containing his digital confession of federal wire fraud. I smoothed the leather and zipped the bag tightly shut. I placed it securely on the small nightstand right next to my bed. I patted the bag gently. It felt exactly like a loaded gun. The complex pieces of the puzzle were now fully seamlessly assembled. I possessed the undeniable certified proof of his financial embezzlement. his offshore shell companies, his fraudulent purchase of the luxury yacht, and his maliciously fabricated sterility. I had everything I desperately needed to execute a flawless total destruction of his entire life. I lay back against the crisp white hospital pillows. My physical body was slowly healing, but my mind was sharper and colder than it had ever been. I would absolutely not call him. I would not tell him about the premature birth or the terrifying medical crisis. I would let him confidently continue to believe that he had completely won the game. I would let him arrogant plan his lavish engagement gala with the real estate heiress. I would wait patiently in the absolute silence until the exact perfect moment. And when he stood proudly before the world, feeling the most arrogant and the most untouchable, I would pull the trigger on his entire fraudulent existence. The harsh flickering red neon light from the motel sign outside my window pulsed rhythmically, casting long bloody shadows across the peeling floral wallpaper. The air inside the tiny room was thick with the suffocating stench of stale cigarette smoke, damp carpeting, and cheap industrial bleach. I sat cross-legged on the sagging mattress, my lower back throbbing with a dull, relentless ache. I was 24 weeks pregnant, physically exhausted, and entirely isolated from the world. But my mind was moving with the terrifying, calculating speed of a predator. I dumped the contents of my leather tote bag onto the faded bedspread. A tube of lipstick, a pack of prenatal vitamins, a wallet filled with declined debit cards, and a heavy rectangular object wrapped securely in an old scarf. I pulled the fabric away and stared at the old backup tablet Liam had casually discarded months ago. He had told me the battery was completely dead and instructed me to throw it in the trash. My frugal habits had saved it from the landfill. I'd originally brought it into this squalid room, hoping to wipe it clean and pawn it for enough cash to buy a hot meal. I had absolutely no idea that I was holding the exact digital blueprint of my husband's entire fraudulent existence. I plugged the frayed charging cable into the loose wall outlet. The screen remained dark for 3 agonizing minutes before the glowing white logo finally materialized. I navigated to the settings menu, desperately searching for the factory reset option. The device required an internet connection to wipe the hard drive. I tapped on the wireless network icon and selected the unsecured free guest network provided by the motel. The small blue checkmark appeared. The tablet was officially connected to the internet. The exact moment the device established a connection, a sharp, piercing chime echoed through the quiet room, then another and another. The tablet suddenly began to vibrate violently against the faded bedspread. A massive, relentless flood of digital notifications cascaded down the lock screen with terrifying speed. Hundreds of alerts rapidly multiplied into thousands. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I stared at the screen in absolute shock. Liam had deleted his primary user profile, but he had made a fatal, incredibly arrogant technological mistake. He had forgotten to sign out of his primary cloud storage account. The old tablet was now aggressively syncing 8 months of backlogged data directly from his current smartphone and his private corporate laptop. I did not panic. I did not cry. My analytical brain immediately took absolute control. I grabbed a stack of cheap motel notepads and 4 blue ballpoint pens from the dingy lobby. I spread them out across the bed, transforming the damp mattress into a meticulous war room. I put on my reading glasses and tapped the green messaging icon. The application opened to a highly active, encrypted chat log. The contact name was saved simply as Savannah. I clicked on the thread, and the visceral, sickening exchanges between my husband and the 24-year-old real estate heiress illuminated the dark room. I traced the exact timeline of their disgusting affair. The messages from 6 months ago perfectly coincided with the exact week I had happily surprised Liam with the news of my pregnancy. Liam wrote, "Savannah, my love, I cannot stand another night in this boring house with her. She told me she is pregnant today. It makes me physically sick. I am looking at her right now and all I can think about is your beautiful face." Savannah replied, Oh my God, Liam, that is so gross. You promised me you were going to leave that frumpy teacher. I am not waiting around forever. My father wants to introduce me to a corporate lawyer next week. Liam wrote back instantly. Do not go near anyone else, Savannah. You are mine. I am already moving the money. I just need a little more time to set up the perfect exit. I am going to make sure she looks like an absolute monster, so your father welcomes me with open arms. We will be sipping champagne in the Mediterranean by next summer. I promise you, my queen. My blood turned into absolute ice. I read message after message. They openly mocked my changing pregnant body. They laughed about how incredibly gullible I was when Liam lied about working late. But the most horrifying messages were the ones detailing his precise, methodical plan to destroy me. He wrote to her last month. Savannah, I fabricated the medical records today. The sterility report looks absolutely flawless. I paid a private clinic in the city $5,000 under the table to forge the doctor's signature. Tomorrow, I will drop the bomb at the church potluck. The entire congregation will turn on her instantly. She will have absolutely no money, no friends, and no credibility. Your father will see me as a tragic, honorable victim, Savannah replied. Liam, you are an absolute genius. I love you so much. Did you secure the boat yet? I stopped breathing. The boat. My mind raced back to the massive $15,000 withdrawal I had seen on my banking app, labeled as a luxury maritime retainer. I closed the messaging application and opened the synced cloud storage drive. I needed to see exactly where the rest of our money had gone. I tapped on a folder titled Offshore Portfolios. The folder contained dozens of highly complex, heavily encrypted financial spreadsheets. As a former high school history teacher, I had never dealt with international corporate finance. But as a desperate cornered mother fighting for her survival, I possessed an unmatched ability to learn and connect the dots. I spent the next 4 hours sitting on that sagging bed, analyzing every single document, wire transfer receipt, and hidden ledger. Liam had always bragged about managing the retirement funds for the church elders, the charity endowments, and the massive building fund meant for the new youth center. Everyone in our affluent congregation blindly handed him their money. I opened his master financial spreadsheet. Liam had categorized the massive monthly withdrawals from the church accounts as secure domestic bond investments. But when I cross-referenced the routing numbers, I found a terrifyingly complex web of deliberate deceit. He had set up a series of domestic shell companies using Savannah's real estate connections to mask the trail. He named them Crescent Maritime and Apex Horizon Holdings. I ran the tax identification numbers through the state business registry using the Motel network. The registered agent for every single fraudulent entity was a private wealth attorney located in Miami. I mapped out the exact flow of the embezzled money with my blue pen. Liam transferred the church charity endowments into his legitimate corporate brokerage accounts. He aggressively filtered the cash through multiple dummy accounts to completely wash the digital fingerprints. Finally, the laundered money was wired directly into his private offshore portfolios in the Cayman Islands. The sheer scale of his theft was absolutely staggering. He had stolen over $4 million from the devout, trusting congregation who had just publicly condemned me. I found the finalized bill of sale for the luxury yacht. The purchase price was $2.5 million. The buyer was explicitly listed as Savannah's personal shell company. The funds had been wired directly from the embezzled church charity accounts. He was using the stolen money from the very people who had shunned me to buy his young mistress a luxury yacht for their planned escape. I also found the property deed for a massive oceanfront villa located in Belize. Belize was a country with notoriously complicated extradition treaties. He was actively purchasing a permanent, untraceable escape route. Then I found the most horrifying document of all. It was tucked away in a hidden subfolder labeled Contingency. I tapped on the file, and the color completely drained from my face. It was a forged legal document bearing a near-perfect imitation of my own handwriting. Liam had drafted a fake power of attorney, granting me unilateral access to the church investment funds. Alongside the forged document were fabricated bank statements linking my personal debit card to an illegal offshore gambling site. He was not just going to divorce me and leave me penniless on the street. He was actively planning to frame me for his entire multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme. I opened his chat log with Savannah to confirm my terrifying suspicions. The messages sent just 2 days ago confirmed my absolute worst nightmare. Liam wrote, "Savannah, my queen, the church board just scheduled their mandatory annual financial audit for the 15th of next month. That gives us exactly 3 weeks to finalize everything. The yacht is fully stocked and waiting in the Miami marina." "We fly out on the 12th, Savannah replied. "I cannot wait, Liam. Are you absolutely sure the audit will not trace the missing money back to my family trust fund? My father would kill me if he found out." Liam answered with disgusting, arrogant confidence. "I am positive, my love. I have already planted the forged gambling debts on Caroline's personal computer at the house. When the church elders discover the missing $4 million, they will find the digital trail leading straight to her. She is already a disgraced, cheating outcast. The police will easily believe she stole the money to fund a secret double life. We will be drinking expensive champagne on our balcony in Belize before the federal authorities even issue a warrant for her arrest." I sat perfectly still in the freezing room. Liam thought he had executed the flawless crime. He thought he had left me utterly defenseless, financially ruined, and socially destroyed. He thought I was just a naive, weak woman who would disappear into the night and eventually take the fall for his massive federal crimes. But he had made one fatal, incredibly arrogant miscalculation. He had carelessly handed me the exact keys to his entire destruction. I now possessed the undisputed digital proof of his adultery, his forged medical documents, his offshore shell companies, and his multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud. The clock was ticking. I had exactly 3 weeks before the church audit. I had exactly 3 weeks before Liam and Savannah boarded a plane to Miami and vanished into the Caribbean forever. If I did not act with absolute precision, he would successfully escape to a non-extradition country, and I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison for a crime I did not commit. I gathered my handwritten notes and stacked them neatly on the small wooden desk. I mapped out the exact timeline of his impending escape. I knew exactly what I had to do. I could not simply take this information to the local police. Liam was incredibly wealthy and deeply connected in our town. He would use his high-priced lawyers to drag out the investigation while he quietly slipped out of the country. I needed to build a trap so completely inescapable that he would not even realize he was caught until the steel bars slammed shut around him. I needed a federal intervention. I needed to meticulously verify every single fraudulent wire transfer. I needed to ensure that Savannah's powerful family was dragged directly into the center of the scandal so they could not use their immense wealth to protect him. I looked down at my pregnant belly and placed my hand firmly against my child. I promised my unborn son that his father would absolutely pay for every single thing he had done. I would wait for the exact moment he felt the most untouchable, the most arrogant, and the most victorious. And then I would tear his entire world apart. The morning light began to filter through the thin curtains of the motel room. The harsh red glow of the neon sign finally faded into the pale dawn. I picked up my blue pen and wrote down the name of the most ruthless corporate attorney in the city. I was ready to begin my counterattack. The silent, submissive wife was dead. The cold, calculating survivor had officially taken absolute control. The damp walls of the cheap roadside motel room seemed to press inward as the days bled into the nights. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the sagging mattress with the glowing screen of Liam Old backup tablet illuminating my pale face. Victoria Vance, the ruthless corporate attorney I had secretly retained, was quietly and meticulously working her back channels with the federal authorities. She was handing over the mountain of digital evidence I had uncovered and coordinating a massive silent strike with the Internal Revenue Service and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My specific assignment was incredibly difficult, but absolutely necessary for our survival. I had to remain entirely invisible. I had to live in this squalid, decaying motel room and maintain absolute silence so that Liam would firmly believe I was completely destroyed and utterly defeated. I ate cheap canned soup and drank tap water from a plastic cup while I watched his entire treacherous life unfold on the synced device resting on my lap. I knew that bringing the federal authorities down on Liam would guarantee his imprisonment, but I needed to completely obliterate his safety net before the government agents ever knocked on his door. Liam was heavily relying on Savannah and her incredibly powerful family to protect him. Her father was a formidable commercial real estate mogul named Richard, who possessed a net worth in the hundreds of millions. Liam firmly believed that by marrying Savannah, he would gain immediate access to an impenetrable fortress of high-priced corporate lawyers and endless financial backing. He thought Richard would view him as a tragic, honorable Christian man who had been terribly wronged by a deceitful wife. If Richard deployed his massive legal team to defend Liam, the federal investigation could drag on for years, and Liam might actually find a way to slip through the cracks and escape to his offshore sanctuary in Belize. I knew I had to systematically sever that powerful lifeline. I had to show Richard exactly what kind of parasite was trying to attach itself to his family empire. I opened my encrypted email server and began to draft the most devastating digital dossier of my entire career. I did not write a passionate, angry letter from the perspective of a scorned, heartbroken wife. I knew a billionaire like Richard would simply ignore emotional appeals and dismiss them as irrational jealousy. Instead, I approached the task with the cold, steely precision of a senior forensic accountant presenting a catastrophic risk assessment to a board of directors. I titled the anonymous email as a highly confidential corporate risk advisory regarding imminent federal wire fraud implications. I attached the meticulously organized spreadsheets, tracing the exact flow of the $4 million Liam had embezzled from the church charity endowments. I highlighted the routing numbers and the specific dates of the illicit transfers, but the most crucial piece of the puzzle was the final destination of the stolen money. I attached the official registration documents for the dummy corporations Liam had set up to launder the stolen church funds. I clearly highlighted the names of the registered agents and the primary beneficiaries of those fraudulent shell companies. The name printed on every single illegal offshore account was Savannah. Liam was not just having a disgusting affair with the young real estate heiress. He was actively and deliberately using her as an unwitting financial mule to process millions of dollars in stolen charity funds. He was buying her a luxury yacht and designer jewelry using money covered in federal digital fingerprints. By registering the shell companies in her name, he was directly exposing her to massive criminal liability and severe federal tax evasion charges. He was positioning Savannah to take the absolute brunt of the legal fallout if the authorities ever traced the money back to the dummy accounts. He was using the pristine reputation of her powerful family as a human shield for his own despicable crimes. I attached the forged medical documents regarding his fake sterility and the fabricated gambling debts he had planted on my personal computer to frame me. I provided the undeniable certified proof of his entire premeditated conspiracy. I concluded the anonymous email with a simple objective statement, advising Richard that the federal authorities were already quietly reviewing the attached documents and that any entity financially associated with Liam would soon be subject to a massive federal asset freeze and intense public scrutiny. I took a deep, steadying breath and pressed the send button. The encrypted file vanished into the digital ether, flying directly to the private secure inbox of the most ruthless real estate mogul in the city. I sat back against the cheap motel headboard and imagined the absolute seismic shockwave that email would cause when it landed on Richard's massive mahogany desk. A man who had built a billion-dollar empire did not reach the top by being gullible or soft. He would not scream or throw a childish tantrum. He would immediately summon his own elite team of forensic accountants to quietly verify the anonymous data I had provided. It would only take his experts a matter of hours to confirm that every single word and every single routing number in my dossier was absolutely flawless. Richard would realize with cold, horrifying clarity that the charming wealth manager courting his daughter was actually a highly radioactive federal target. He would see exactly how Liam was callously using Savannah as a dumping ground for stolen church funds. The realization that Liam was jeopardizing the family immaculate public image and dragging his only daughter into a federal wire fraud conspiracy would absolutely enrage a man like Richard. But true corporate sharks do not broadcast their fury. They operate in complete, absolute silence. Through the synced tablet, I watched the silent, devastating retaliation begin to unfold over the next few days. Richard did not call Liam to confront him. He did not forbid Savannah from seeing him. Instead, Richard instructed his army of corporate attorneys to begin a swift, covert extraction. I monitored the financial dashboards on the tablet and watched as the massive family trust accounts suddenly stopped accepting transfers from Liam firm. I saw the digital alerts pop up as Richard's legal team quietly detached their corporate portfolios from Liam Wealth Management umbrella. Richard was systematically and invisibly pulling the plug on the entire operation. He was sealing off the watertight doors of his own empire and leaving Liam completely isolated on a sinking ship. Liam was completely oblivious to the silent financial slaughter happening right beneath his feet. He was entirely consumed by his own arrogant delusions of absolute victory. I watched his text messages with Savannah update in real time on my glowing screen. He was aggressively planning a lavish, extravagant engagement gala to be held at the most exclusive country club in the city. He wanted to publicly solidify his new status and parade his wealthy young bride in front of the very same church community that had just thrown me out onto the street. He wanted to rub his miraculous recovery in the faces of the congregation playing the part of the blessed redeemed man who had finally found true love after escaping a toxic, deceitful marriage. His messages to Savannah were filled with sickening vanity and ridiculous entitlement. He sent her pictures of imported white orchids and vintage bottles of champagne he was ordering for the grand event. He bragged about the custom-tailored tuxedo he was having shipped from Italy. He told her that he had finally secured the perfect life for them and that they would be entirely untouchable once they were officially married. Savannah replied with endless strings of heart emojis, completely unaware that her father was actively dismantling her future husband's financial stability. She was just a spoiled, entitled girl, blinded by the shiny stolen gifts and the romantic lies. Occasionally, a brief flash of confusion would appear in Liam messages to his junior partners. He would text his office manager complaining about minor strange banking glitches when he tried to route funds through the new trust accounts. He would express mild annoyance that Richard corporate attorneys were suddenly unresponsive to his emails regarding the merger of their investment portfolios. But his massive, blinding narcissism prevented him from ever seeing the actual truth. He simply brushed off the warnings as temporary administrative delays. He firmly believed he was the smartest man in every single room. He truly thought he was an unstoppable mastermind who had perfectly manipulated everyone around him. I sat in the damp darkness of the motel room, wrapped in a cheap, scratchy blanket, and smiled a cold, hollow smile. The sheer magnitude of his blind stupidity was almost breathtaking. He had no idea that the money he was using to pay the country club deposits was currently being tracked by federal agents. He had no idea that the wealthy, powerful family he was trying to infiltrate had already recognized him as a toxic parasite and was silently cutting him loose. He had absolutely no idea that his discarded pregnant wife was sitting in a squalid room armed with the undeniable certified DNA proof of his paternity and the digital keys to his federal prison cell. Victoria called me on a secure, encrypted line late one evening to confirm our progress. She told me the federal task force had officially completed their preliminary review of the offshore accounts and the forged church financial statements. The Internal Revenue Service was quietly preparing the asset freezing injunctions. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was finalizing the wire fraud and embezzlement warrants. Victoria warned me that the tension was reaching a critical boiling point and that I had to remain completely hidden until the exact moment the trap was ready to spring shut. She told me the authorities wanted to execute the takedown when Liam felt the most secure so they could catch him completely off guard and prevent any desperate last-minute attempts to destroy the digital servers. I assured Victoria that I was perfectly fine living in the shadows for a few more weeks. The physical discomfort of the cheap motel and the heavy, aching pressure of my pregnant belly were absolutely nothing compared to the dark, thrilling anticipation of watching his world prepare to violently collapse. Every single day that passed was another day Liam spent decorating his own lavish execution chamber. I watched him send out the digital invitations for the engagement gala. He invited every single church elder, every wealthy client, and every influential member of our suburban town. He wanted an audience for his triumph. He wanted a crowded room to witness his ascension to the absolute top of the social ladder. He was actively building the grandest, most spectacular stage possible. He was setting up the perfect lighting and arranging the most expensive, beautiful props. He was making absolutely certain that every single important person in his life would be standing in that country club ballroom on the night of the gala. He wanted them all to see him shine. But I knew the absolute truth. I knew that the polished hardwood floors of that country club ballroom were entirely rotten beneath his expensive imported leather shoes. I knew that the beautiful white orchids and the vintage champagne were all purchased with stolen dirty money that was currently being tracked by federal agents. I knew that the powerful billionaire father of his young bride was silently watching him with pure, absolute disgust, waiting for the perfect moment to throw him to the wolves. I closed the cover of the old backup tablet and placed it gently on the small wooden desk next to my handwritten ledgers. I lay down on the sagging motel mattress and rested my hands on my stomach. The baby kicked strongly against my palms, reminding me exactly why I was enduring this squalor and silence. I was protecting my son from a monster who had tried to erase his very existence for a few $1 million and a luxury yacht. I closed my eyes and let the freezing cold, calculating energy wash completely over me. The trap was perfectly set. The federal net was completely woven. The financial shield had been silently and totally removed. Liam was walking blindly and arrogantly directly into the center of the slaughterhouse, and I was going to be the one to personally lock the heavy steel doors right behind him. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the dimly lit motel room. The woman staring back at me was a complete stranger, and yet she was the most authentic version of myself I had ever seen. My postpartum body still carried the physical toll of bringing my son into the world just a few short weeks ago, but I did not hide it. Instead, I armored it. I wore a sharp, perfectly tailored jet black suit. The dark fabric hugged my shoulders with a rigid, unyielding structure. I had pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight knot at the nape of my neck. My makeup was flawless and incredibly cold. I applied a bold crimson lipstick that felt like a declaration of absolute war. I slipped my feet into a pair of black leather stilettos. Every single step I took echoed against the cheap linoleum floor with a sharp metallic click. It was the sound of a woman who had crawled out of the darkest abyss and was now marching directly toward absolute, total vengeance. I picked up my leather tote bag. It held the flash drive containing the digital execution of my husband. The drive was loaded with the certified DNA results, the fabricated sterility report, the offshore banking ledgers, and the undeniable proof of his massive federal wire fraud. I walked out into the cool evening air and drove away from the squalor I had endured for the past month. The drive to the Oak Ridge Country Club was a journey between two entirely different universes. The club sat on a sprawling, immaculate estate, surrounded by ancient weeping willows and perfectly manicured golf greens. This was the most exclusive and expensive venue in the entire state. It was a place where multi-million-dollar deals were struck over vintage scotch and hand-rolled cigars. I pulled my unassuming sedan up to the grand entrance. The valet, a young man in a crisp white uniform, looked at my car with a hint of confusion before his eyes met mine. I stepped out of the vehicle and handed him the keys with a cold, terrifying authority. He swallowed hard and immediately stood up, perfectly straight, taking the keys without a single word. I did not look back at him. I walked up the wide, sweeping stone steps toward the heavy mahogany doors of the main ballroom. The pulsing sound of a live string quartet drifted through the warm night air. I slipped through a side service entrance, perfectly bypassing the main reception desk. I knew this building well. Liam had brought me here exactly once for a corporate charity dinner during our first year of marriage. I navigated the quiet, carpeted service corridors until I reached the heavy velvet curtains that draped the back entrance of the grand ballroom. I pulled the heavy fabric back just an inch and peered into the cavernous, opulent space. The sheer visual excess of the room hit me like a physical blow. Liam had spared absolutely no expense. Hundreds of imported rare white orchids cascaded from massive crystal chandeliers hanging from the vaulted ceiling. Waiters in pristine black tuxedos circulated through the crowd, balancing silver trays loaded with crystal flutes of vintage champagne and imported caviar. A massive hand-carved ice sculpture of two intertwined swans sat in the center of the room, catching the brilliant light, and standing right in the middle of this grotesque display of stolen wealth were the people who had completely destroyed me. I scanned the beautifully dressed crowd. I saw the senior elders of our church congregation, the exact same men and women who had looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust when Liam threw me out on the street. They were laughing and clinking their expensive champagne flutes, completely oblivious to the fact that they were drinking away their own stolen charity endowments. I saw Patricia standing near the front of the room. She wore a stunning emerald green gown and a necklace of heavy, authentic diamonds. Her silver hair was styled flawlessly. She looked incredibly proud, soaking up the admiration of the wealthy crowd like a bloated parasite. And then I saw them. Liam and Savannah. They were standing at the base of the grand stage. Savannah was draped in a custom white silk gown that easily cost $20,000. Her neck and wrists were heavy with diamonds purchased with stolen church funds. She was laughing, her shrill musical voice cutting through the elegant music. Liam stood beside her, looking like a prince holding court. He wore a custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedo. His hair was perfectly styled. His teeth gleamed white as he smiled for the hired photographers. He looked absolutely untouched by guilt. He looked victorious, arrogant, and completely convinced of his own untouchable brilliance. A deep, sickening wave of nausea twisted in my stomach, but I forced it down immediately. The heat of my righteous fury burned away any remaining physical weakness. I let the velvet curtain fall back into place and moved silently down the dark hallway toward the audio-visual control booth. The booth was elevated at the back of the ballroom, providing a perfect, unobstructed view of the massive dual projection screens flanking the main stage. I turned the brass handle and stepped inside the small, dark room. A young technician wearing a black headset was sitting in front of a massive mixing console. He spun around in his swivel chair, his eyes widening in surprise as I invaded his workspace. "Excuse me, ma'am, you are not supposed to be in here," he stammered, pulling one side of his headset off his ear. "This is a restricted area for the event staff." I walked directly toward him. My black stilettos clicked sharply against the wooden floorboards. I did not raise my voice. I did not blink. I looked him dead in the eyes, with a gaze as sharp as a knife. "I am the event coordinator for Mr. Thompson." I lied smoothly, my voice radiating absolute, undeniable boss energy. "There has been a last-minute change to the presentation schedule. I am taking over the main projection feeds for the groom's special announcement. You can take a 15-minute break. Go get a coffee. Now." The sheer force of my absolute confidence completely paralyzed the young man. He looked at my sharp, tailored suit, my cold expression, and the heavy leather bag in my hand. He did not question my authority for a single second. He nodded quickly, placed his headset on the desk, and scurried out of the small, dark booth without looking back. I was entirely alone. I locked the heavy door behind him. I walked over to the main computer terminal and plugged my flash drive into the primary port. The screen flickered as the folders loaded. I opened the master presentation software and meticulously queued up my documents. I arranged the files with deadly precision. On the left screen, I cued the official certified DNA results from the hospital and the evidence of the forged sterility report. On the right screen, I cued the massive federal wire fraud ledgers, the offshore bank statements, and the finalized bill of sale for Savannah Luxury Yacht. I linked the visual feeds to the main ballroom projectors, but I kept the screens perfectly black. I placed my finger hovering gently over the primary execute button. I waited in the absolute darkness. Through the soundproof glass window of the booth, I watched Liam step up onto the grand stage. A spotlight hit his handsome, arrogant face. He tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, percussive sound echoed through the massive ballroom. The string quartet immediately ceased playing. The crowd of hundreds slowly quieted down, turning their attention to the man of the hour. Savannah stood at the base of the stage, gazing up at him with blind, adoring devotion. Patricia stood beside her, wiping a fake theatrical tear from her eye. "Thank you all for being here tonight." Liam began, his voice echoing through the massive speakers with a sickeningly smooth charm. The room fell into absolute reverent silence. As I look out at all of your beautiful faces, I am completely overwhelmed with gratitude. This past year has been an incredibly difficult journey for me. As many of you in our beloved church community know, I was forced to walk through a very dark valley. I faced a devastating betrayal that completely broke my heart and tested my faith in humanity. I clenched my jaw so tightly my teeth ached. The absolute unmitigated audacity of his lies was breathtaking. He was actually standing in front of the congregation he was actively robbing and asking for their pity. But God works in incredibly mysterious ways. Liam continued, his voice dropping into a tone of humble reverence. He removes the toxic darkness from our lives to make room for the brilliant, beautiful light. And that light is my incredible, radiant Savannah. The crowd erupted into warm, polite applause. Savannah beamed and blew him a kiss. Liam smiled, his perfect white teeth flashing under the spotlight. "Savannah has healed my broken heart," Liam proclaimed. "She has shown me what true, absolute loyalty looks like. And tonight, we are not just celebrating our love. We are celebrating a massive new chapter. Next week, Savannah and I will be departing on an incredible international business venture. We are expanding my wealth management firm into the global market, starting with a beautiful new headquarters in the Caribbean. We are leaving the painful past behind us and sailing directly into a bright, prosperous future." He raised his crystal champagne flute high into the air. "So please raise your glasses," Liam commanded, his voice booming with arrogant triumph. "To new beginnings, to absolute truth, and to the beautiful, perfect future." I stared down at the glowing computer console. My heart pounded a slow, terrifyingly calm rhythm against my ribs. To absolute truth. That was my exact cue. I pressed the enter button. Inside the grand ballroom, the dual massive projection screens flanking the stage suddenly roared to life with a blinding, brilliant white light. The sudden visual explosion made the entire crowd physically jump. Liam froze, his champagne flute still raised in the air, his perfect smile faltering as he turned to look at the massive screen on his left. There, displayed in towering 10-foot letters for the entire room to see, was the official certified medical report from the county hospital. The bright red hospital seal was prominently magnified. The text was crystal clear. Patient Caroline Thompson, infant male, paternal match Liam Thompson, probability of paternity 99.99%. A loud collective gasp violently rippled through the massive ballroom. Hundreds of champagne flutes stopped halfway to hundreds of mouths. The silence that followed was incredibly heavy and terrifying. Before anyone could even process the massive biological revelation, the right screen flashed. It displayed the fabricated sterility report Liam had handed out at the church potluck, positioned right next to an email receipt from a shady downtown clinic, proving he had paid $5,000 to forge the doctor's signature. Liam's face drained of all human color. His tanned skin turned a sickly ashen gray. His arm slowly dropped to his side, the champagne sloshing out of his expensive crystal glass and staining the polished hardwood floor. He stared up at the massive screens, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. "What is this?" Savannah shrieked, her shrill voice cutting through the horrified silence of the room. "Liam, what is that screen saying? What does that mean?" Liam could not answer her. He was completely paralyzed by the massive digital execution happening right above his head, but I was not finished. I tapped the keyboard again. The screen shifted. The medical documents vanished and were instantly replaced by the massive, sprawling financial ledgers of his offshore shell companies. The left screen displayed the exact routing numbers of the church charity endowments and the youth center building fund. The right screen displayed the offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands. A bright red digital arrow connected the church funds directly to Savannah Personal Shell Company, Crescent Maritime. The crowd of wealthy church elders began to physically push forward toward the stage, their faces twisted from shock into absolute, unadulterated fury. These were the men and women who had trusted Liam with their life savings. They were currently staring at the undeniable digital proof that their millions of dollars were sitting in a Caribbean bank account. I tapped the keyboard one final time. The screen on the right flashed to the finalized bill of sale for the luxury yacht. The purchase price of $2.5 million was highlighted in bright yellow ink. The buyer was explicitly listed as Savannah. "Look at the dates," an older man in the front row suddenly roared, pointing a shaking finger at the massive projection screen. "That is the exact day our building fund was drained. He stole our money. He stole our charity money to buy a boat for this girl." The elegant, lavish gala instantly devolved into absolute chaotic madness. Women began screaming in horror. Men threw their champagne glasses to the floor in disgust. Savannah Father Richard pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his face purple with homicidal rage. He grabbed Liam by the lapels of his custom midnight blue tuxedo and shoved him violently against the wooden podium. "You dragged my daughter into federal wire fraud, you pathetic parasite!" Richard roared, his voice booming over the sound of the panicked crowd. "You used her name to launder stolen money. I'm going to bury you beneath a federal prison." Patricia was hyperventilating near the ice sculpture, clutching her diamond necklace and screaming for security to turn off the screens. But no one came to help her. The entire room had completely turned into a mob of furious, betrayed victims. I stepped away from the glowing computer console. I unlocked the heavy door of the audio-visual booth and pulled it open. I walked out onto the elevated landing that overlooked the entire grand ballroom. I stood perfectly still at the top of the wide, carpeted staircase. I did not scream. I did not shout a single word. I simply stood there in my sharp, tailored black suit, looking down at the absolute total destruction I had just unleashed. Liam managed to tear himself away from Richard's brutal grip. He stumbled backward, gasping for air and desperately scanning the chaotic room for any possible escape route. As his panicked, terrified eyes swept across the upper landing, he finally saw me. He froze completely. The noise of the screaming crowd seemed to vanish from his ears as he stared up at me. He looked at my cold, emotionless face. He looked at my sharp, tailored suit. He looked at the woman he had completely underestimated and callously thrown away like garbage. I looked down at him. My gaze was as cold and sharp as a surgeon's scalpel. I did not smile. I simply tilted my head slightly, locking eyes with the monster who had tried to erase my son. I let him see the absolute chilling boss energy radiating from every single pore of my body. I let him fully understand that the fragile, submissive wife he thought he knew was entirely dead. I was the architect of his ruin, and I had just burned his entire fraudulent empire straight to the ground. Savannah was sobbing hysterically on the floor of the stage, her $20,000 dress ruined by spilled wine. Patricia was backed into a corner, trying desperately to hide from the furious, screaming church elders. Liam was trapped in the center of the stage, completely surrounded by the people he had robbed and manipulated. There was absolutely no escape. There was no international business venture. There was no tropical beach in Belize. There was only the cold, hard reality of his complete, inevitable destruction. I turned my back on the screaming, chaotic ballroom. I did not need to see the police arrive. I did not need to watch him get dragged away in handcuffs. The trap had been flawlessly sprung. The truth was entirely exposed. My son was safe, and my vengeance was absolutely complete. I walked slowly down the dark, carpeted hallway, my stilettos clicking a steady, victorious rhythm against the floor. I walked out the heavy mahogany doors and stepped into the cool, clean night air, leaving the burning wreckage of his life far behind me. The grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club was completely engulfed in absolute, unadulterated chaos. The dual projection screens towering above the main stage continued to glow with blinding white light, displaying the undeniable digital proof of Liam and his horrific crimes. On the left screen, the certified medical report from the county hospital proved with 99.99% certainty that Liam was the biological father of my newborn son. On the right screen, the meticulously organized financial ledgers exposed the massive shell companies and the offshore bank accounts hiding the stolen church charity endowments. The beautiful imported white orchids and the elaborate hand-carved ice sculpture of intertwined swans now felt like a grotesque mockery of a man who had built his entire existence on a foundation of absolute lies. The elegant string quartet had completely vanished, leaving only the deafening roar of hundreds of furious, betrayed guests. Richard, the formidable real estate billionaire and Savannah father, stood at the base of the stage with his face twisted into a mask of pure, homicidal rage. He had built his massive empire from the ground up, and he possessed a net worth in the hundreds of millions. Liam had arrogantly believed that marrying Savannah would grant him permanent, unrestricted access to Richard's incredibly powerful legal team and bottomless financial resources. Liam thought he could use Richard as an impenetrable human shield against the federal authorities. But the digital dossier I had anonymously sent to Richard earlier that week had already completely severed that lifeline. Richard had brought his elite corporate attorneys to the gala tonight, not to celebrate the engagement, but to publicly and viciously execute the man who had dared to use his daughter as an unwitting mule for federal wire fraud. Richard grabbed Liam by the expensive lapels of his custom midnight blue tuxedo and shoved him violently against the heavy wooden podium. "You actually thought you could use my daughter to launder $4 million of stolen charity money?" Richard roared. His booming voice echoed through the massive ballroom, completely silencing the surrounding crowd. "You set up offshore shell companies in Savannah's name. You bought a $2.5 million luxury yacht using stolen church funds and registered it under her social security number. You deliberately exposed my only child to massive federal tax evasion charges just to cover your own filthy tracks. You are nothing but a pathetic, parasitic thief, Liam. I am going to deploy every single lawyer in my firm to ensure you never see the light of day again. I will personally supervise your absolute destruction." Savannah was huddled on the floor of the grand stage, weeping hysterically into the folds of her $20,000 custom white silk gown. Her diamond necklace sparkled under the stage lights, but her entirely entitled, arrogant demeanor had completely evaporated. She finally realized that her handsome, charming fiancé was actually a highly radioactive federal target who was actively planning to throw her to the wolves the very second the authorities started asking questions. The wealthy elders of our suburban church congregation pushed their way through the sea of panicked guests. Just 1 month ago, these exact same men and women had parted like the Red Sea to cast me out of their pristine community. They had looked at me with pure, absolute disgust when Liam stood in the churchyard and falsely accused me of carrying a bastard child. They had blindly trusted his fake tears and his fabricated sterility report. But now the absolute truth was staring them directly in the face. They looked up at the massive projection screen and saw the exact routing numbers of their youth center building fund and their retirement endowments. They saw the dates of the illicit transfers perfectly matching the days Liam had told them their investments were suffering devastating market losses. The profound hypocrisy of the congregation completely collapsed in real time. The people who had fiercely protected him and shunned me suddenly realized they were the ones who had been brutally scammed. An older church elder with a trembling hand pointed directly at the offshore banking ledgers displayed on the screen. "He stole our money," the older man shouted, his voice cracking with absolute heartbreak and furious indignation. "He stole the money meant for the orphanage. He took our retirement savings to buy a boat for his young mistress. The crowd of church members immediately surged forward, surrounding the stage with terrifying, hostile energy. Liam was completely trapped. The impenetrable fortress he thought he had built around himself had entirely evaporated. Richard had physically tossed Liam aside like a piece of worthless garbage. Liam stumbled backward, gasping for air, his perfectly styled hair now completely disheveled and his custom tuxedo torn at the collar. His chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths as he desperately scanned the chaotic ballroom for any possible escape route. His eyes darted past the furious church elders, past the weeping Savannah, and past the terrified country club staff. And then his terrified, panicked eyes swept up toward the elevated landing of the audio-visual control booth. He finally saw me. I stood perfectly still at the top of the wide, carpeted staircase, looking down at the absolute total slaughter I had just meticulously orchestrated. I wore my sharp-tailored jet black suit, my posture perfectly straight, and my gaze as cold and unforgiving as a diamond. The physical pain of my recent premature labor was entirely masked by the pure, thrilling adrenaline pumping through my veins. Liam's face instantly drained of all remaining color. His tanned skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. He stared up at me, his mouth opening and closing in absolute stunned silence. In that exact moment, the brilliant, arrogant facade completely shattered. He finally realized that the naive, submissive wife he had casually thrown away was actually the brilliant, ruthless architect of his entire demise. Caroline Liam choked out his voice barely audible over the roaring crowd, but I could read his lips perfectly. He dropped heavily to his knees, right there on the polished hardwood stage. The man who had proudly stood before our church and called me a cheating fraud was now desperately groveling at my feet in front of hundreds of people. Caroline, please, you have to stop this. You have to tell them it is a misunderstanding. I did not mean to do it. I was going to come back for you. Please, Caroline, I am begging you. He clasped his hands together in a pathetic display of absolute submission. He actually thought he could still manipulate me. He actually believed that if he cried and begged, I would somehow magically erase the massive federal evidence projected on the screens behind him. I did not smile. I did not blink. I simply looked down at him with a chilling, empty stare. I wanted him to fully absorb the absolute finality of his situation. I wanted him to feel the exact same suffocating, terrifying helplessness I had felt when he threw a $5,000 check at me and told me to get rid of my unborn son. Before Liam could utter another pathetic word, the heavy mahogany double doors at the main entrance of the grand ballroom violently swung open. The loud, percussive crash silenced the furious crowd instantly. Everyone turned to look at the entrance. Marching through the doors in perfect synchronized formation was a team of 15 heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical jackets with the bright yellow letters FBI printed boldly across their backs. Flanking the federal agents were several stern-faced investigators from the Internal Revenue Service. And leading the entire formidable tactical procession was Victoria Vance. Victoria was the ruthless, silver-haired corporate attorney I had secretly retained. She wore a pristine gray suit and carried a thick leather briefcase containing the finalized federal warrants. I had promised myself I would build a trap so completely inescapable that Liam would not even realize he was caught until the steel bars slammed shut. Victoria and I had spent the past 3 weeks secretly coordinating this exact moment with the federal authorities. We had filed a secret injunction regarding the embezzled church funds, entirely locking down his offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands before he could ever board a plane to Belize. The federal agents swiftly moved through the parted crowd. Their presence radiated absolute, undeniable authority. 2 agents marched directly up the stairs to the main stage. Liam remained paralyzed on his knees, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. Liam Thompson, the lead federal agent, stated, his voice echoing clearly through the massive silent ballroom. "We have a federal warrant for your immediate arrest on multiple counts of grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, and severe tax evasion. You have the right to remain silent." Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The agent forcefully grabbed Liam by his arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs snapped around Liam's wrists with a sharp, metallic click. The sound was incredibly loud and deeply satisfying. Liam began to physically thrash and weep uncontrollably. He looked back up at the balcony, desperately searching for my face. "Caroline, help me!" he screamed, his voice cracking in absolute raw panic. "Caroline, please do not let them take me." I did not move a single muscle. I watched with pure, cold satisfaction as the federal agents dragged my treacherous husband off the grand stage and marched him directly through the center of the ballroom. As the agents escorted Liam toward the exit, Patricia suddenly panicked. The formidable matriarch who had proudly stood on her front porch and instructed me to terminate my pregnancy was now actively attempting to scurry out of the side service doors like a frightened, cowardly rat. She had discreetly removed her heavy diamond necklace and was trying to blend into the shadows of the catering corridor, but Victoria Vance had already anticipated her cowardly escape. Victoria gestured to 2 Internal Revenue Service investigators, who swiftly intercepted Patricia before she could even reach the exit. Patricia gasped and tried to push past them, her perfectly coiffed silver hair falling wildly into her face. "Patricia Thompson," Victoria said, stepping squarely in front of the panicked older woman. "You are not going anywhere tonight. I hold a federal indictment naming you as a primary co-conspirator in a massive international money laundering operation. We have the digital evidence, proving you actively helped your son forge medical documents to deliberately defraud the church community and mask the flow of illicit funds. The authorities will be thoroughly investigating your personal estates and your private bank accounts." Patricia let out a shrill, terrified shriek as the agents instructed her to place her hands behind her back. She looked incredibly small, incredibly pathetic, and entirely stripped of her arrogant suburban power. She had thought I was just a temporary placeholder, a high school history teacher with a mediocre pedigree. She had severely underestimated the absolute devastating intellect of a mother protecting her child. The agents placed handcuffs on Patricia and escorted her out of the ballroom right behind her sobbing, humiliated son. The massive country club ballroom was left in a state of profound, shell-shocked silence. The opulent engagement gala had been completely transformed into a highly public federal crime scene. Richard was aggressively speaking with Victoria, officially turning over all of Savannah Dummy Corporation records to the federal investigators to save his own real estate empire from the fallout. Savannah was being comforted by her private security team, her dreams of sailing the Mediterranean entirely destroyed. The church elders stood in small huddled groups, murmuring in absolute disbelief and deep, profound regret. They finally realized that the man they had fiercely protected and worshipped was a cynical predator who had systematically robbed them blind. They realized that the pregnant woman they had so cruelly shunned was actually the only person brave enough to expose the truth and stop the financial bleeding. The church community members who had previously condemned me were now completely paralyzed by their own profound guilt. Several of the older women who had refused to look me in the eye at the church potluck were now openly weeping, covering their faces in deep, humiliating shame. They had actively participated in my cruel banishment based entirely on Liam fabricated lies. They had allowed a pregnant woman to be thrown onto the street while they happily drank tea with the man who was actively stealing their retirement funds. The absolute crushing weight of their collective failure hung heavily in the warm air of the country club ballroom. I knew that they would spend the next several years aggressively battling federal auditors, trying desperately to recover fractions of the millions Liam had funneled into the Caribbean. Their pristine, perfect suburban congregation had been permanently shattered by the very toxic greed they had blindly invited into their inner circle. I felt a deep, settling peace wash over my tired, recovering body. The heavy jet black suit I wore felt like the armor of a completely victorious general stepping off the battlefield. Victoria Vance looked up toward the balcony and gave me a single firm nod of absolute professional respect. We had executed the legal slaughter with flawless, devastating precision. We had bypassed the slow, messy local courts and delivered a highly radioactive federal case directly to the highest authorities. Liam had thought he was a mastermind playing a brilliant game of chess. He never realized that I had already flipped the entire board. I walked down the quiet, carpeted service corridor, leaving the frantic chaos of the ballroom entirely behind me. The cool night air hit my face as I stepped out of the heavy mahogany side doors. The valet rushed forward to retrieve my unassuming sedan. He looked at me with a newfound expression of absolute awe and terror, having clearly heard the massive commotion inside the building. I slid into the driver's seat and placed my hands firmly on the leather steering wheel. I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror one final time. The naive, trusting history teacher was gone forever. The woman looking back at me was a fierce, incredibly protective mother who had successfully burned a fraudulent empire to the ground to ensure the absolute safety of her child. I shifted the car into drive and pulled away from the sprawling estate. My son was waiting for me at the hospital, and we had an entire beautiful, peaceful life to begin building together, far away from the ashes of their absolute ruin. 6 months have passed since the night the grand ballroom of the Oak Ridge Country Club completely descended into absolute chaotic madness. I stood by the large bay window of my newly purchased home, holding a warm mug of black coffee in my hand. The morning sun streamed through the immaculate glass, casting a bright golden glow across the polished hardwood floors. In the adjoining nursery, my beautiful, perfectly healthy baby boy was sleeping soundly in his crib. The rare blood complication that had nearly taken him from me was entirely resolved. He was a thriving, happy child who would grow up surrounded by absolute, unconditional love and complete safety. He would never know the damp squalor of a roadside motel, and he would certainly never know the toxic, treacherous monster who had fathered him. The air in my new home was incredibly clean and peaceful. There was absolutely no stench of cheap vanilla and jasmine perfume lingering in the hallways. There were no hushed, deceptive phone calls taking place behind locked study doors. There was only the quiet, triumphant serenity of a woman who had successfully navigated her way through absolute hell and emerged completely victorious. I took a slow, deep sip of my coffee and allowed my mind to briefly wander back to the incredible legal slaughter that had completely obliterated my ex-husband. Liam was currently residing in a maximum security federal penitentiary. He had been stripped of his custom-tailored midnight blue tuxedos, his expensive imported leather shoes, and his incredibly arrogant smirk. He was now just another federal inmate, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, completely isolated from the wealthy, glamorous world he had so desperately tried to steal. The federal judge had shown him absolutely zero mercy during the sentencing hearing. The undeniable digital evidence I had meticulously compiled alongside the brilliant, ruthless legal strategy of Victoria Vance had left Liam with absolutely no viable defense. I remember sitting in the front row of the federal courtroom, watching the final moments of his destruction. The heavy mahogany walls of the courtroom felt incredibly solemn and unforgiving. The judge read aloud the massive, staggering list of his crimes: grand larceny, corporate embezzlement, international wire fraud, severe tax evasion. The judge explicitly noted the incredibly cruel, calculated manner in which Liam had fabricated medical documents and publicly destroyed his pregnant wife just to facilitate his theft. When the gavel finally fell, the sound echoed like a gunshot. The judge sentenced Liam to 15 years in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. Liam had turned to look at me one final time before the federal marshals dragged him away. His face was gaunt, his skin a sickly pale gray, and his perfectly styled hair was thinning and unkempt. He fell to his knees in the middle of the courtroom, weeping uncontrollably and begging me to forgive him. He pleaded with me to let him see his son. He promised he would spend the rest of his life making it up to me if I just asked the judge for leniency. I did not shed a single tear. I did not offer him a single word of comfort. I simply looked down at him with a gaze as cold and sharp as a diamond. I let him fully realize that the naive, submissive woman he had thrown away was entirely dead. In her place stood the architect of his absolute ruin. I turned my back on him and walked out of the courtroom, leaving him to his miserable, lonely fate. His reputation and his wealth were completely and permanently obliterated. The federal authorities had moved with terrifying speed to seize every single asset connected to his name. The luxury yacht he had purchased for Savannah with stolen church funds was immediately confiscated by the government and sold at a federal auction. The massive oceanfront villa in Belize was seized and liquidated. The offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands were completely frozen, and the millions of dollars he had embezzled were systematically repatriated back to the United States. Victoria Vance had been an absolute legal shark in family court. Because of the overwhelming evidence of financial fraud and severe emotional abuse, the family court judge completely bypassed standard divorce proceedings. I was awarded sole absolute legal and physical custody of my son. Liam was permanently stripped of all parental rights. He would never be allowed to contact us ever again. Furthermore, the judge awarded me triple damages for the intentional dissipation of marital assets. Every single penny I had poured into his firm from my teaching salary was returned to me with massive punitive interest. I walked away from the divorce with total financial independence, while Liam was left with absolutely nothing but a mountain of federal fines and a prison sentence. He was not the only one who faced severe, devastating consequences. Patricia, the cruel, formidable matriarch, who had handed me a $5,000 check and instructed me to terminate my pregnancy, found herself completely ruined. The federal investigators discovered her undeniable digital fingerprints all over the forged medical documents. She was officially indicted as a primary co-conspirator in the money laundering operation. Her pristine social reputation was instantly destroyed. The bank foreclosed on her sprawling suburban estate to pay for the massive federal penalties. The woman who had prided herself on her wealthy, immaculate Christian image was forced to move into a tiny, rundown apartment, completely shunned by the society she had once ruled. Savannah and her incredibly powerful billionaire father had completely erased Liam from their existence. Richard had utilized his massive army of corporate attorneys to shield his daughter from federal prosecution, but the public humiliation was entirely unavoidable. Savannah was widely ridiculed in our affluent social circles as the foolish, spoiled heiress who had unknowingly acted as a digital mule for a federal criminal. Unable to handle the intense public mockery, she packed her designer bags and permanently relocated to Europe, disappearing completely from the local scene. The church community that had so quickly and cruelly turned their backs on me faced their own incredibly bitter reckoning. The senior elders and the wealthy congregation members who had parted like the Red Sea to let me flee in tears finally realized the absolute staggering magnitude of their mistake. They realized that they had actively protected and worshipped a cynical predator who was simultaneously robbing their charity endowments and their retirement portfolios. The very same women who had looked at me with pure, unadulterated disgust at the church potluck later attempted to call me and beg for my forgiveness. They left pathetic, weeping voicemails claiming they had been terribly deceived and that they wanted to welcome me back into the congregation with open arms. I deleted every single voicemail without listening to the end. I blocked their numbers and permanently severed all ties with that toxic, hypocritical community. I had absolutely no desire to return to a place that had only valued me when it was convenient. They had blindly trusted a charming, wealthy man and immediately discarded a vulnerable, pregnant woman. They were now left to spend the next several years aggressively battling federal auditors, trying desperately to recover fractions of the millions Liam had stolen from them. They had to live with the agonizing knowledge that their own harsh, judgmental actions had allowed a monster to thrive in their inner circle. With my stolen assets fully returned and my life completely secure, I knew I could not simply return to my old, quiet existence. The incredible, terrifying trauma I had endured had fundamentally altered my entire perspective on life. I realized that there were thousands of other women out there who were currently trapped in the exact same terrifying nightmare. Women who had sacrificed their careers, their independence, and their entire identities to support manipulative, treacherous men. Women who were being secretly, financially slaughtered in the dark, completely unaware that their husbands were draining their accounts and plotting their destruction. I took the massive financial settlement I had won in court and used it to officially launch a specialized nonprofit organization dedicated entirely to financial literacy and legal advocacy for betrayed women. I rented a beautiful modern office space in the city and hired a dedicated team of forensic accountants and aggressive family law attorneys. We specifically focused on helping women trace hidden offshore accounts, uncover fabricated debts, and legally combat financial abuse in high-net-worth divorces. Every single day, women walked into my office with tear-swollen eyes and trembling hands. They looked exactly like I had looked on the day I sat in that freezing, damp motel room. They were terrified, isolated, and completely convinced that their powerful husbands had left them with absolutely no way to survive. I would sit across from them, slide a warm cup of coffee across the desk, and look them directly in the eyes. I would tell them my story. I would show them exactly how to wipe away their tears, how to stop pleading for mercy, and how to start fighting back with cold, steely precision. We taught these incredible women how to secure their digital evidence, how to track vanished funds, and how to build completely inescapable legal traps for the men who thought they were untouchable. We turned their heartbreaking victimhood into a massive weapon of absolute justice. The naive, submissive wives who walked into my building always walked out as fiercely protective, independent warriors, completely ready to dismantle the fraudulent empires their husbands had built on their backs. My son was growing up surrounded by this incredible, powerful energy. He was surrounded by strong, brilliant women who refused to be silenced or discarded. He would never be taught that a man's value is tied to his custom suits or his ability to manipulate a crowded room. He would be raised with genuine integrity, absolute honesty, and a profound respect for the truth. I walked away from this bay window and moved quietly into the nursery. I looked down at my sleeping baby boy, listening to his soft, rhythmic breathing. A profound, unbreakable sense of peace completely settled into my soul. The journey from that terrifying church potluck to this beautiful, serene morning had been the most grueling, agonizing battle of my entire life. But looking back, I would not change a single second of it. The pain had completely burned away the weak, dependent version of myself and forged a woman made of absolute, unbreakable steel. Karma is an incredibly patient and flawless judge. It never misses an address, and it never forgets a debt. Liam and Patricia had tried to completely erase my existence to secure their own greedy ambitions. They had dug a massive dark grave and fully expected me to fall into it. Instead, they were the ones buried alive beneath the crushing weight of their own despicable lies. They lost their freedom, their wealth, and their dignity, while I reclaimed my entire life and found a purpose far greater than I could have ever imagined. Women can sacrifice and we can patiently endure. We can pour our entire souls into building a beautiful life for the people we love. But we should never, ever be foolish. We must never surrender our independence or close our eyes to the truth. When a treacherous, narcissistic man tries to push you into a dark corner when he attempts to steal your money, ruin your reputation, and completely erase your truth, you must not collapse. You must wipe your tears, use your brilliant intellect, and show them exactly what happens when a woman with absolutely nothing left to lose decides to strike back. If you feel satisfied with this ending, please give me a like and subscribe to the channel. What time is it? Where you are watching this video, and where are you from? Let me know in the comments below.